Carl Jung explained. 7 spiritual patterns men fall into before real awakening. Jung's most dangerous discovery wasn't about mental illness. It was about the spiritual patterns that destroy men who mistake performance for transformation. In 1913, after his break with Freud, Jung nearly went insane. Visions, voices, a descent into what he called the confrontation with the unconscious. For years, he documented this terrifying journey in what would become the Red Book, a manuscript he kept hidden for decades because it revealed something forbidden about masculine spirituality. What he discovered would change psychology forever, but it would also expose a truth most men spend their entire lives running from. Jung found that men cycle through 7 predictable spiritual patterns before they can access genuine awakening. These patterns aren't random. They're archetypal defenses, psychological armor the ego constructs to avoid the one thing that would actually transform you: death. Not physical death, but ego death. The complete dismantling of who you think you are. And here's what makes this dangerous. Each pattern feels like awakening. It looks like progress. It earns you respect, admiration, even followers. But underneath, you're trapped in an unconscious loop, repeating the same initiatory failure your father repeated and his father before him. The spiritual bypasser who meditates away his rage. The warrior addict who mistakes intensity for depth. The guru disciple who outsources his sovereignty. The victim mystic who weaponizes his suffering. The intellectual dissociator who lives in his head. The transcendence junkie chasing peak experiences. The savior complex trying to fix everyone but himself. 7 patterns, 7 traps, 7 ways men avoid the descent that would actually make them whole. Jung called this process individuation, the journey toward becoming a complete human being by integrating everything you've rejected about yourself: your shadow, your wounds, your power, your vulnerability. But here's the problem. Modern culture has abandoned the ancient rites of passage that once guided men through this transformation. No elders, no initiation, no roadmap from boyhood to manhood. So men improvise. They collect spiritual experiences like trophies. They chase gurus and systems and retreats, hoping someone will hand them the answer. They perform masculinity, dominance or withdrawal, aggression or passivity, because no one taught them what mature masculinity actually looks like. And they wonder why, despite all the work, all the meditation, all the therapy, they still feel empty. Jung knew why. Because you can't think your way to wholeness. You can't transcend your way there. You can't achieve, perform, or accumulate your way into authentic manhood. You have to descend. You have to face the parts of yourself you've been running from your entire life. The rage you inherited from your father, the shame you carry about your body, your sexuality, your desires, the terror of your own power, the grief you've never let yourself feel. This isn't spiritual bypassing. This isn't positive thinking. This is the psychological crucifixion that every initiated man in history has endured. And if you refuse it, you'll spend decades trapped in one of these 7 patterns, mistaking the cage for the cathedral. Jung saw this in his patients, successful men who had mastered every spiritual path but couldn't sustain a single intimate relationship. Men who could articulate enlightenment but broke down crying when asked about their fathers. Men who radiated peace on the meditation cushion but raged at their children behind closed doors. The patterns were different, but the avoidance was the same. They were all refusing the initiatory descent, and Jung understood why, because he had refused it himself. Before his breakdown, Jung was the golden boy of psychoanalysis. Freud's heir apparent, brilliant, respected, powerful. He had constructed the perfect persona, but underneath the psyche was screaming for integration. When he finally surrendered to the descent, it nearly destroyed him. He saw demons. He dialogued with ancient gods. He confronted parts of himself so terrifying that he questioned his own sanity. But he kept going, and what he found at the bottom wasn't madness, it was wholeness. The rage wasn't something to transcend. It was power waiting to be integrated. The fear wasn't weakness. It was protection asking to be honored. The darkness wasn't evil. It was the rejected masculine begging to be reclaimed. Jung emerged from that journey with a map, not a belief system or a philosophy, but a developmental blueprint for how men move from fragmentation to integration, from performance to authenticity, from spiritual materialism to genuine individuation. That map is what we're about to explore, not as theory, but as lived experience, not as concepts, but as a survival guide for men who are tired of repeating patterns they don't understand. Because here's the truth Jung discovered. These 7 patterns aren't failures, they're necessary stages. Every man cycles through them. The question isn't whether you'll encounter them, it's whether you'll recognize them before they consume decades of your life. Most men don't. They spend their 20s as warrior addicts burning out in pursuit of achievement. Their 30s as spiritual bypassers, meditating away the wreckage of their relationships. Their 40s in victim consciousness, wondering why nothing ever works out. Their 50s chasing transcendence, hoping one more retreat will finally deliver the peace they seek. And they die uninitiated, biologically mature but psychologically adolescent, successful in the world but strangers to themselves, surrounded by people but profoundly alone. Jung called these men the most dangerous force in civilization, because uninitiated men don't just destroy themselves, they destroy everything they touch. They create authoritarian systems, they exploit and dominate. They pass their unprocessed trauma to their children like a genetic curse. But it doesn't have to be this way. Recognition is the first step toward liberation. When you can see the pattern you're trapped in, you gain the power to choose something different. And that's what this journey is about. Understanding where you are, why you're stuck, and what Jung discovered about how to break free. Not through more spiritual techniques, not through harder work or better discipline, through surrender, through dissent, through the willingness to die to who you've been, so you can be born into who you actually are. This isn't a quick fix, it's not a hack. It's the most difficult thing you'll ever do, but it's also the only thing that will set you free. Jung proved it was possible. He mapped the territory. He left the breadcrumbs for men brave enough to follow. The question is, are you ready to stop performing and start descending? Are you ready to see which pattern has been running your life? Are you ready to discover what's waiting for you on the other side of ego death? Because once you see it, you can't unsee it. Once you recognize the cage, you'll never mistake it for freedom again. And that recognition, that moment of brutal honesty, is where real awakening begins. Not in bliss, not in transcendence, but in the courageous acknowledgement that everything you've been doing to avoid transformation has been the very thing keeping you stuck. Let's begin. We're living through an epidemic of uninitiated men, not criminals, not deadbeats, but doctors, entrepreneurs, spiritual teachers, therapists, men who have achieved everything society promised would make them whole, yet feel profoundly empty inside. Jung observed this pattern throughout his career, and he traced it back to a single root cause: the collapse of initiatory structures in modern culture. For thousands of years, every functional society had a mechanism for transforming boys into men, not through aging, not through accumulation, through ritual death and symbolic rebirth. The young man would be separated from his mother, taken into the wilderness by elders, subjected to physical and psychological ordeals that shattered his childish identity. He would confront mortality, face his deepest fears, descend into the unknown. And if he survived, when he survived, he would return transformed, no longer a boy seeking approval, but a man capable of holding the tension between strength and tenderness, independence and connection, power and restraint. This wasn't optional. It was the foundational technology of civilization. Without it, you got what Jung called the puer aeternus, the eternal boy. A man who might be 50 years old but psychologically still 12, seeking mother's approval in every woman, chasing father's validation in every boss, performing masculinity because no one ever showed him what authentic manhood feels like from the inside. Now look around. Modern Western culture has systematically dismantled every initiatory structure. No rites of passage, no separation from the mother, no confrontation with death, no elders to guide the process. We've replaced transformation with transaction, milestones with metrics, initiation with information. You graduate high school, go to college, get a job, make money, maybe get married, accumulate achievements and possessions, and you're supposed to feel like a man. But you don't, because you never died, you never descended, you never shed the adolescent identity and stepped into mature masculinity. So you improvise. You seek initiation unconsciously through extreme sports, combat, entrepreneurial risk, substance abuse, sexual conquest, or spiritual intensity. Your biology demands transformation even when your culture no longer provides it. And you end up trapped in one of two compensatory patterns. The first is fragile masculinity, the overcompensation. You perform dominance, aggression, stoicism, and control because you're terrified someone will see how uncertain you actually feel. You can't show weakness, can't ask for help, can't admit confusion or pain. This is the man who works 80-hour weeks to prove his worth, who lifts obsessively to armor his body, who dominates conversations because silence feels like invisibility, who conquers women but can't sustain intimacy. He looks strong, but he's brittle. One crack and the whole facade shatters. The second is defeated masculinity, the collapse. You've tried performing and failed, or you've been shamed for your natural masculine impulses, so you withdraw. Passivity becomes protection. You stop pursuing, stop risking, stop occupying space in the world. This is the man who lives in his head, isolated from his body and relationships, who watches life happen to other people, who medicates the numbness with screens, porn, substances, or spiritual philosophies that justify his withdrawal. He's not aggressive, but he's not present either. He's a ghost in his own life. Both patterns are trauma responses. Both are attempts to survive in a culture that broke the initiatory container, and both create immense suffering. The statistics tell the story Jung predicted decades ago. Male suicide rates are 3 to 4 times higher than women's in most developed nations. Men die by suicide every minute of every day, and the rate has been climbing for 2 decades. Loneliness is epidemic. 40% of men report having no close friends. They have colleagues, teammates, drinking buddies, but no one they can be vulnerable with, no one who knows them beneath the performance. Purpose crisis is rampant. Men report feeling aimless, replaceable, disconnected from any sense of meaning beyond consumption and survival. The question, "What am I here for?" haunts them, but they have no framework for answering it. Relationship failure is standard. 69% of divorces are initiated by women, often citing emotional unavailability, inability to communicate, or the exhausting burden of carrying the emotional labor of the partnership. And violence, both self-directed and outward, remains overwhelmingly male, not because men are inherently violent, but because uninitiated men don't know how to metabolize their own rage, grief, and power. Jung called this the possession by the archetype. When a man hasn't integrated his warrior energy, it possesses him. He becomes the archetype rather than embodying it consciously. He's not a grounded warrior who knows when to fight and when to yield. He's a berserker, controlled by unconscious rage. When he hasn't integrated his king energy, it possesses him. He becomes either the tyrant or the weakling. He can't hold benevolent authority. He either dominates or abdicates. When he hasn't integrated his lover energy, it possesses him. He's either addicted to conquest or terrified of intimacy. He can't sustain connection because he's never connected to himself. And when he hasn't integrated his magician energy, it possesses him. He dissociates into intellectualism or manipulates others with spiritual bypass. These aren't metaphors. They're lived realities Jung witnessed in patient after patient, decade after decade. The successful CEO who couldn't feel, the spiritual teacher who couldn't relate, the sensitive artist who couldn't act, the disciplined athlete who couldn't rest. All of them cycling through patterns, mistaking movement for progress. But here's what Jung understood that most psychology misses. This isn't pathology, it's arrested development. These men aren't broken, they're uninitiated. They're stuck in an adolescent stage of consciousness because no one guided them through the death that births maturity. In traditional cultures, the elders knew, boys don't become men through time. They become men through ordeal, surrender, and integration. You remove the boy from everything familiar. You strip away his identity, his name, his possessions, his sense of self. You put him through physical trials that break the body's attachment to comfort. You confront him with mortality through isolation, fasting, or symbolic death rituals. And in that liminal space, no longer boy, not yet man, the psyche restructures itself. The child dies. The man is born. But we don't do this anymore. So men hit biological milestones without psychological transformation. They have sex without integrating sexuality. They father children without embodying fatherhood. They lead organizations without mature leadership capacity. And they suffer, not because they're weak, but because the initiatory wound, the absence of conscious transformation, creates a void that nothing external can fill. You try to fill it with achievement, but accomplishment without inner authority feels empty. You try to fill it with relationships, but you can't receive love when you don't inhabit yourself. You try to fill it with spirituality, but transcendence without integration is just sophisticated avoidance. This is why Jung became obsessed with the concept of individuation, the process of becoming a whole self. He realized that modern men need a psychological equivalent of the ancient initiation rites, not tribal rituals we've outgrown, but an internal developmental journey that accomplishes what those rituals once did, the death of the adolescent identity and the birth of mature consciousness. But here's the trap. Most men seeking this transformation end up trapped in spiritual patterns that mimic initiation without delivering it. They chase peak experiences but avoid sustained inner work. They collect techniques but resist the ego death. Those techniques are meant to facilitate. They build spiritual identities that become new forms of performance. I'm the awakened one, the disciplined one, the enlightened one, without realizing they've just swapped masks. Jung saw this clearly. He called it identification with the persona, mistaking your performance for your actual self. And he knew from personal experience how seductive these patterns are, because he fell into them himself. Before his own breakdown, Jung was performing brilliance. He was Freud's chosen successor, the golden child of psychoanalysis, the man who had all the answers. But underneath he was fracturing. His dreams were filled with apocalyptic visions. His body was racked with psychosomatic symptoms. His relationships were strained. And the more successful he became externally, the more terrified he felt internally. Because success without integration is a prison made of gold. You're trapped by your own accomplishments. You can't show weakness without shattering the image. You can't admit confusion without losing credibility. You can't stop performing without losing your identity. So you keep going, keep achieving, keep accumulating evidence that you're okay, but you're not okay. You're uninitiated. And until you face that truth, until you stop collecting spiritual merit badges and start descending into the actual work of transformation, you'll remain trapped in patterns that look like progress but feel like death. The good news? Recognition is the beginning of liberation. Once you see the pattern, you can choose differently. Once you understand that your spiritual pursuits might be sophisticated avoidance, you can stop running and start descending. But first, you need to know which pattern has you, because each of the 7 operates differently. Each has its own seduction, its own shadow, its own way of masquerading as awakening while keeping you stuck. Let's meet them. His name was Michael, though Jung changed it in his notes. He was 38 years old when he first came to Kusnacht, desperate in the way only successful men can be desperate, quietly, efficiently, as if scheduling salvation between business meetings. On paper, Michael had mastered life, elite education, thriving consulting, practice, beautiful family, lakeside home, and an impressive spiritual resume. 10 years of Buddhist meditation, 3 Vipassana retreats, shamanic breathwork training, weekend workshops with every guru passing through Europe, and a bookshelf groaning with every spiritual text from the Upanishads to Eckhart Tolle. He wasn't seeking Jung because he was failing. He was seeking Jung because he was succeeding, and it felt like dying. "I've done everything right," he told Jung in their first session, his voice eerily calm. "I meditate every morning. I've processed my childhood wounds. I lead men's groups. I practice non-attachment. I eat clean. I don't drink. I journal my gratitude." Jung waited. "And I'm more empty than I've ever been." There it was, the crack in the performance. Michael's hands were trembling. He clasped them together, trying to regain composure, but his body was betraying him. Panic attacks had started 6 months prior. Sudden, overwhelming, arriving without warning during client meetings, family dinners, even meditation sessions. His wife had threatened to leave. She said living with him was like living with a hologram, technically present but fundamentally absent. His children asked why Daddy was always busy, even when he was home. And his business, despite its success, felt like pushing a boulder uphill every single day. "Tell me your dreams," Jung said. Michael had 3 recurring ones. In the first, he was drowning in a lake while spiritual teachers watched from the shore, their hands folded in meditation, smiling peacefully as he sank. In the second, he was trapped inside a temple made of gold, beautiful, ornate, but the doors were locked from the inside, and the walls were closing in. In the third, the one that woke him in a cold sweat, a dark figure chased him through forests. Every time Michael tried to run, his legs turned to stone. Every time he tried to hide, the figure found him, and when it finally caught him, just before Michael woke screaming, the figure spoke, "Stop running from me. I am you." Jung listened without judgment. Then he asked the question that would change everything. "What are you running from?" Michael's face went blank. "I'm not running. I'm doing the work." "Are you?" Silence. Jung leaned forward. "You've spent a decade collecting spiritual experiences. You've mastered techniques, philosophies, practices. You can speak the language of awakening fluently. But tell me, when was the last time you felt rage?" Michael blinked. "I don't do rage anymore. I've transcended that." "When was the last time you cried?" "Crying is, I process emotions through meditation." "When was the last time you wanted something so badly it terrified you?" Michael's jaw tightened. "Desire is attachment. I'm learning non-attachment. Jung sat back. Do you know what I think? I think you're the most attached man I've ever met. Attached to your image of being detached. Attached to your identity as the awakened one. Attached to never having to feel the terror of being fully human. The words landed like a blow. Michael's eyes filled with tears, the first real emotion Jung had seen from him. And with the tears came the rage, not at Jung, but at the decades of performance, the exhausting maintenance of the spiritual persona, the relentless pressure to be evolved while dying inside. I don't know who I am, Michael finally whispered. Underneath all of this, I have no idea who I actually am. Jung nodded. Good. That's where we begin. Over the next 3 years, Jung guided Michael through a process that dismantled everything he thought he knew about awakening. They started with the dreams. Jung explained that the drowning dream wasn't about spiritual progress. It was a warning. The gurus on the shore represented Michael's identification with transcendent spirituality. He was literally drowning in his own unconscious, while his idealized spiritual identity watched passively, doing nothing to save him. The temple dream was even more revealing. The gold symbolized spiritual materialism, accumulating practices and experiences as if they were currency. The locked doors meant he'd imprisoned himself inside his own spiritual construct. And the closing walls? That was the psyche's way of saying, this path is suffocating you. But the third dream, the dark figure, that was the key. Jung identified it immediately as Michael's shadow. Everything he'd rejected in his spiritual pursuit. His rage, his desire, his ambition, his sexuality, his hunger for power, his grief, his fear, his raw, unedited humanity. You've been trying to transcend your shadow, Jung explained. But the psyche doesn't work that way. What you reject doesn't disappear. It gains power in the unconscious and eventually hunts you down. Michael had spent a decade in spiritual bypass. Meditation wasn't helping him become present, it was helping him dissociate. Breathwork wasn't releasing trauma, it was giving him peak experiences that distracted from unprocessed wounds. Men's groups weren't creating authentic connection. They were providing audiences for his performance of vulnerability. Every spiritual practice had become a defense mechanism against feeling what he actually needed to feel. But I've processed everything, Michael protested. I've done plant medicine ceremonies. I've worked with therapists. I've faced my father wound. Have you? Jung asked. Or have you intellectualized your father wound? Talked about it, conceptualized it, created a narrative around it, but never actually grieved the father you needed and never had. Michael went silent. Tell me about your father. And there it was, the locked door. Michael's father was a successful businessman, distant, critical, emotionally unavailable. He didn't drink or rage or abuse. He was just absent. Present at dinner but unreachable, successful in the world but a ghost at home. Michael had spent his entire adult life unconsciously replicating his father's pattern while consciously trying to be different. He'd become successful like his father, emotionally unavailable like his father, present but absent just like his father. And when his wife said she felt alone in the marriage, when his children complained he was always busy, he was hearing the exact words he'd once said about his own father. I'm terrified of being him, Michael finally admitted. I'm terrified that no matter what I do, I'm just going to become him. Jung leaned forward, then stop running from him, stop trying to transcend him, and start grieving him. The work that followed was brutal. Jung had Michael do active imagination, dialoguing with the internalized image of his father. At first, Michael's responses were intellectual, controlled, but Jung pushed him to stay in the body, to feel rather than think. And when Michael finally let himself feel, The grief was overwhelming. He grieved the father who never saw him, the father who never asked how he felt, the father who taught him that success was the only language of love, the father who was so afraid of his own inner world that he taught Michael to be afraid too. But underneath the grief was something else. Rage. Pure, unedited, white-hot rage at having to perform his entire life, at never being allowed to be weak, confused, or uncertain, at the impossible standard of masculine perfection that left no room for humanity. Jung didn't try to calm the rage. He encouraged it. Let it come. Let it move. This is the power you've been meditating away. And as Michael finally allowed himself to feel the rage he'd spent a decade transcending, something shifted. The rage wasn't destructive. It was life force. It was the no he'd never been allowed to speak. It was the boundary he'd never been taught to hold. It was the masculine fire that had been dampened by spiritual bypass. But there was more. Underneath the rage was terror. The terror of his own power. The terror of what he might become if he stopped controlling himself. The terror that if he let himself be fully alive, he might destroy everything. And underneath the terror, grief again, but different this time. Grief for the boy who had to become a man before he was ready. Grief for the adolescent who never got to rebel. Grief for the young man who learned to perform love instead of receiving it. Grief for all the years spent trying to be good instead of learning to be whole. Jung recognized what was happening. This wasn't therapy. This was initiation. Michael was dying to his old identity. The spiritual seeker, the successful man, the perfect father, the evolved husband. All of it was burning away, leaving him naked and terrified in the rubble of his own carefully constructed life. This is the descent, Jung told him. This is what your dreams have been calling you toward. Not more transcendence, not more spiritual achievement, but descent into the rejected, abandoned, feared parts of yourself. For 6 months, Michael couldn't meditate. His practice felt hollow, mechanical. For the first time in a decade, he stopped going to retreats, stopped reading spiritual texts, stopped performing awakening. He just felt, and it was excruciating. His marriage almost ended. His wife confronted him about years of emotional unavailability, and he had no defense. He couldn't bypass with spiritual language. He couldn't intellectualize. He just had to listen and feel the impact of his absence. His business struggled. He couldn't muster the performance energy that had driven his success. Clients noticed something different. He was less polished, less certain, more human. His children saw him cry for the first time, and through it all, Jung held the container. "You're not falling apart," he would say. "You're falling together. The false self is dying so the real self can emerge." Slowly, something new began to form. Not a new identity, not a better version of Michael, but something more fundamental. Presence. He started showing up in his body instead of hovering above it. Started feeling his emotions in real time instead of processing them through meditation later. Started being with his wife and children instead of performing fatherhood and partnership. The panic attacks stopped, not because he transcended his anxiety, but because he integrated it. The anxiety was information. His body screaming that the performance was unsustainable. His dreams changed too. The drowning stopped, the temple disappeared, and the dark figure, it transformed into a guide, leading him deeper into forests, not to hunt him, but to show him what he'd abandoned. 3 years into the work, Michael sat in Jung's office and said something remarkable. "I'm not awakened. I'm not evolved. I'm not enlightened. I'm just here. And that feels like more than I've ever been." Jung smiled. "Now we're doing real work." That's when the true individuation process began, not as bypass or transcendence, but as integration. Michael learning to hold the tension between his power and his vulnerability, between his need for solitude and his need for connection, between his masculine drive and his capacity for receptivity. He didn't become perfect, he became whole. And years later, when Jung reflected on this case in his notes, he wrote, "Michael arrived as a spiritual success story. He left as a human being. That is the only transformation that matters." Jung's observations about masculine initiation weren't just psychological theory. Modern neuroscience, anthropology, and developmental psychology have confirmed what he intuitively understood. The male brain and psyche require specific developmental stages to reach maturity. Without these stages, men remain neurologically and psychologically adolescent, regardless of chronological age. Let's start with the biology. Research from developmental neuroscience shows that the male brain doesn't fully mature until the mid to late 20s. Specifically, the prefrontal cortex, responsible for impulse control, emotional regulation, long-term planning, and moral reasoning, is the last region to develop. But here's what Jung understood that modern science is only now confirming. Biological maturation isn't the same as psychological initiation. You can have a fully developed prefrontal cortex and still be emotionally adolescent. You can be 40, 50, 60 years old with the neurological equipment for mature masculinity, but never having undergone the psychological transformation that activates it. Why? Because the brain requires specific experiences to create new neural pathways. Dr. Dan Siegel's research on interpersonal neurobiology reveals that our brains are shaped by relational experiences, particularly during critical developmental windows. The male psyche, specifically, requires certain initiatory experiences to neurologically restructure itself from adolescent to adult consciousness. Joseph Campbell, drawing on comparative mythology, identified these experiences as stages of the hero's journey: separation, initiation, and return. But these aren't metaphors, they're psychological necessities with neurological correlates. Stage 1. Separation from the mother. Anthropologist David Gilmour studied initiation rites across cultures and found a universal pattern. Boys must be psychologically separated from maternal influence to develop autonomous masculine identity. This isn't about devaluing the feminine or mothers. It's about neurological differentiation. The mother-child bond is the first and most powerful attachment system in human development. For healthy development, this bond must eventually be transcended, not rejected, but transformed from dependent fusion to individuated connection. In traditional cultures, this separation was ritualized. Boys were physically removed from the mother's home, often abruptly and dramatically. They were taken by male elders into liminal spaces, forests, deserts, mountains, where maternal comfort was unavailable. Why? Because the adolescent male brain is wired to seek comfort and avoid threat. Separation from the mother activates the stress response system, forcing the brain to develop new coping mechanisms beyond dependency. Modern Western culture largely skips this stage. Boys remain psychologically fused with mothers well into adulthood, not because mothers are doing anything wrong, but because there's no cultural mechanism for conscious separation. The result? Men who unconsciously seek maternal energy in romantic partners, who can't make decisions without external validation, who rage against women for not understanding them while simultaneously demanding emotional caretaking. Jung identified this as the mother complex, an unconscious psychological pattern where the man remains identified with the son archetype, unable to embody mature masculine autonomy. Neuroscience confirms this. Studies show that men with insecure attachment patterns, often rooted in disrupted maternal bonding, have difficulty regulating their amygdala, the brain's threat detection center. They're either hyper-reactive, fragile masculinity, or hypo-reactive, defeated masculinity. But here's the crucial point. This isn't fixed. The brain retains neuroplasticity throughout life. The separation can happen later, but it requires conscious initiation. Stage 2. Confrontation with mortality. Robert Moore and Douglas Gillette's work on masculine archetypes reveals that every functional masculine initiation includes an encounter with death. Not metaphorical death, actual visceral confrontation with mortality. In traditional rites, this was explicit. Young men were subjected to ordeals that genuinely threatened survival: scarification, extreme physical trials, isolation without food, symbolic burial, or psychoactive substances that dissolved ego boundaries. The purpose wasn't cruelty, it was neurological restructuring. When the brain encounters genuine life threat, it activates the most ancient survival systems. The prefrontal cortex goes offline. The amygdala floods the system with cortisol and adrenaline. Time perception shifts. Ego boundaries dissolve. You're forced into pure presence, no past, no future, just the immediate now of survival. And if you survive, when you survive, the brain reorganizes around that experience. You've died and been reborn. Neurologically, you're not the same person. Psychologist Dr. Stanislav Grof, researching holotropic states, found that ego-death experiences, whether through meditation, breathwork, or psychedelics, create permanent shifts in consciousness when integrated properly. The brain develops new pathways between the prefrontal cortex and limbic system, allowing for better emotional regulation. The default mode network, the brain's self-referential hub, becomes less dominant, reducing egocentricity. In Jung's language, the persona, ego, is shattered, and the self, the deeper organizing principle, emerges to guide consciousness. But modern men rarely encounter genuine death. We've sanitized risk, eliminated ordeal, created comfortable, predictable lives where mortality is abstracted into insurance policies and retirement plans. So men unconsciously seek death encounters, extreme sports, combat sports, entrepreneurial risk, substance abuse, even suicidal ideation. The psyche demands transformation. If culture won't provide it, biology will improvise. The problem? Without ritual container and elder guidance, these improvised initiations often lead to actual death or re-traumatization rather than transformation. Stage 3. Submission to something greater. Anthropologist Victor Turner studied liminal states, the in-between space during initiation, where the old identity has died but the new hasn't yet formed. He found that successful initiations always include a period of communitas, the dissolution of individual ego into collective experience. The initiate must surrender control, submit to forces greater than himself, nature, elders, tribe, spirit, death itself. This submission isn't about obedience, it's about shattering the adolescent illusion of individual omnipotence. Neuroscientist Dr. Andrew Newberg's research on mystical experiences reveals that during states of deep meditation, prayer, or ritual, the parietal lobe, which creates our sense of separate self, decreases activity. The result is a felt experience of unity, dissolution of boundaries, and connection to something larger than ego. This neurological state mirrors what happens in traditional initiations. The sense of I dissolves into we. The initiate experiences himself as part of something vast, ancient, interconnected. And when he returns from that experience, he can never see himself as purely separate again. His decisions are informed by awareness of impact on family, community, future generations. Jung called this the development of the self, the organizing principle that transcends ego and recognizes interconnection. But again, modern culture skips this stage. We glorify individualism, self-made success, and personal autonomy. We teach boys to be independent, self-sufficient, never needing anyone. The result? Men who can't submit, can't surrender, can't trust anything beyond their own will. They become either tyrants, demanding submission from others while refusing it themselves, or isolated, unable to belong because belonging requires vulnerability. Stage 4, integration and return. The final stage of traditional initiation is return to the community, not as the boy who left, but as the initiated man who brings gifts back. Psychologist Erik Erikson identified this as generativity, the developmental stage where mature adults become concerned with guiding the next generation. But neuroscience reveals something deeper. The brain is wired for meaning-making through contribution. Dr. Viktor Frankl's research on logotherapy showed that humans require purpose beyond personal survival. When we serve something larger than ourselves, the brain releases dopamine, oxytocin, and serotonin, the neurochemicals associated with well-being and fulfillment. Traditional initiations culminated in the young man returning with a new name, new role, new responsibilities. He wasn't just a man, he was a provider, protector, teacher, elder in training. His masculine identity was tied to contribution, not consumption. Modern men lack this stage entirely. They achieve success but have no framework for what success is for. They accumulate resources but have no clear purpose beyond accumulation. And the brain, deprived of meaningful contribution, becomes depressed. This is why so many successful men experience existential crisis in their 40s and 50s. Biologically, the brain is wired for generativity at this stage. But culturally, we've defined success as personal comfort and security. The result is wealthy, comfortable, profoundly empty men. The spiritual bypassing trap. Dr. John Wellwood coined the term spiritual bypassing to describe the use of spiritual practices to avoid psychological work. Jung observed this constantly. Patients who could recite Buddhist sutras but couldn't have an honest conversation with their spouse. Men who spent hours in meditation but raged at their children. Seekers who preached compassion but were cruel to themselves. Neuroscience explains why this happens. Meditation, breathwork, and other spiritual practices activate the parasympathetic nervous system, the rest and digest response. This feels peaceful, centered, grounded. But here's the trap. You can use these practices to regulate away uncomfortable emotions rather than process them. Dr. Bessel van der Kolk's trauma research shows that unprocessed trauma gets stored in the body and nervous system. You can meditate for decades and never touch it if you're using meditation as dissociation rather than integration. The brain learns to associate spiritual practice with escape from feeling. The practice becomes a sophisticated defense mechanism. Jung saw this in Michael and countless other patients. Men who had mastered spiritual techniques but were using them to avoid the actual work of feeling, grieving, raging, and integrating their shadow. This is why Jung insisted on embodiment, bringing consciousness into the body, emotions, relationships, and daily life, not transcending them. The neuroscience of shadow integration. Modern neuroscience has confirmed Jung's most controversial insight. We must integrate what we've rejected, not transcend it. Dr. Richard Schwartz's internal family systems model shows that every part of the psyche, even the bad parts, exists for a reason. Rage protected you. Shame kept you safe. Fear prevented annihilation. When you try to eliminate these parts through spiritual practice, the brain interprets it as self-attack. The rejected parts go underground, gaining power in the unconscious. But when you approach them with curiosity rather than judgment, the brain can reorganize. Studies on self-compassion, Dr. Kristen Neff, show that when we meet our shadow with acceptance rather than shame, The prefrontal cortex comes back online. We can think clearly, regulate emotions, and make conscious choices. This is shadow integration, recognizing that your rage is power, your fear is protection, your shame is a guardian that learned the wrong lesson. You don't eliminate them, you mature them, you give them new jobs in your integrated psyche. The collective impact. Dr. Bruce Perry's research on intergenerational trauma reveals that uninitiated men don't just harm themselves, they traumatize their children, who traumatize their children, creating cascading dysfunction across generations. Uninitiated fathers can't attune to their children's emotional needs because they can't attune to their own. They model emotional suppression, avoidance, or explosion. They pass on the father wound they never healed. But here's the hopeful finding. One generation of conscious initiation can break the cycle. When a man does his own individuation work, confronts his shadow, grieves his wounds, integrates his rejected parts, he becomes what Jung called the ancestor who breaks the curse. His children don't inherit his unprocessed trauma. They inherit his hard-won wisdom, his emotional capacity, his groundedness. This is why masculine initiation isn't selfish. It's the most generous thing a man can do, interrupting the transmission of pain and creating a new lineage of wholeness. Modern substitutes and their failures. In the absence of traditional initiation, modern men unconsciously seek substitutes. Military service provides ordeal and brotherhood, but often re-traumatizes without adequate integration. Entrepreneurship provides risk and achievement, but without elder guidance often creates workaholism and burnout. Extreme sports provide death encounters, but without ritual context become adrenaline addiction. Psychedelics provide ego dissolution, but without preparation and integration can fragment rather than unify. Men's groups provide community, but without initiatory structure often devolve into therapy circles or performance contests. The pattern is clear. The impulse toward initiation is biological and inevitable, but without conscious structure, these substitutes create as much harm as healing. The research verdict. Every branch of modern psychology, developmental, evolutionary, neurobiological, trauma-informed, confirms Jung's core insight. Men require specific initiatory experiences to reach psychological maturity. These experiences must include separation from dependency, confrontation with mortality, submission to something greater, integration of rejected parts, and return to community with purpose. Without these stages, men remain neurologically capable of maturity, but psychologically unable to embody it. They know what mature masculinity should look like. They can intellectualize it, perform it, teach it, but they can't be it, because knowing isn't the same as undergoing. And this is why the 7 patterns Jung identified are so seductive and so dangerous. They mimic initiation without delivering transformation. They provide the feeling of progress. Meditation feels like growth. Achievement feels like maturity. Spiritual knowledge feels like wisdom, but the brain hasn't actually reorganized. The neural pathways remain adolescent. The emotional capacity remains undeveloped. The relational patterns remain unchanged. And men cycle through these patterns for decades, wondering why, despite all the work, all the practice, all the effort, they still feel fundamentally the same, because they're trying to think their way through a process that requires dying. Not metaphorically, not conceptually, but actually letting the old self dissolve so the new can emerge. And that requires something modern men have been taught to avoid at all costs: surrender. Now we arrive at the heart of Jung's discovery, the 7 archetypal patterns that men unconsciously cycle through before genuine initiation. These aren't personality types. They're developmental stages that every man encounters. The question isn't whether you'll experience them, It's whether you'll recognize them before they consume decades of your life. Most men get stuck in one pattern, building an entire identity around it. Some cycle through multiple patterns, mistaking the movement for progress. But each pattern serves the same unconscious function, avoiding the ego death required for true maturation. Let's examine them one by one. Pay attention to which one activates something in you: recognition, defensiveness, or that uncomfortable feeling of being seen. That's your current pattern. Pattern 1, the spiritual bypasser. I've transcended my ego. I'm beyond suffering. I've released attachment. The spiritual bypasser appears to be the most evolved man in any room. He's calm, centered, speaks in measured tones about presence, non-attachment, and universal love. He's been meditating for years. His home is minimalist. His speech is careful, purged of judgment or negativity. He radiates peace, but underneath, he's numb. The bypasser discovered early that spiritual practice could regulate uncomfortable emotions. Anxiety, meditate. Anger, observe it without attachment. Sadness, recognize it as the ego's illusion. Every spiritual tool became a defense mechanism. He didn't transcend his emotions. He dissociated from them. He didn't achieve equanimity. He achieved disconnection. Jung identified this pattern in patients who could discuss their childhood trauma with eerie detachment, as if describing someone else's life. They'd done the therapeutic work, processed the memories, forgiven their parents, but they couldn't access the actual feelings. One patient told Jung, "I understand my father was emotionally abusive and I've released that." Jung asked him to imagine his father in the room. The man's hands began trembling. His breath quickened. His jaw clenched. "What are you feeling?" Jung asked. "Nothing. I'm observing the physical sensations." That's not observation. That's avoidance. The bypasser's relationships reveal the pattern. His partner complains he's present but unavailable. He listens, but there's no emotional resonance. He's kind, but there's no passion. He's supportive, but there's no genuine vulnerability. Sex becomes mechanical. Emotions become intellectual. Connection becomes performance. Because he's not actually present, he's hovering above his life, observing it from a safe distance. The shadow motivation. What's the bypasser avoiding? Usually rage, grief, or terror that felt too overwhelming to feel. Often he experienced emotional chaos in childhood, a parent's volatility, family dysfunction, or his own uncontrolled emotions that brought punishment. He learned early. Feelings are dangerous, so he sought philosophy that validated suppression. Emotions are illusions. The ego is the problem. Desire is suffering. These teachings aren't wrong, but he's using them wrong. He's weaponizing wisdom against his own humanity. The cultural reinforcement Western spiritual culture glorifies the bypasser. We celebrate men who are beyond ego, unattached, centered. We mistake emotional suppression for enlightenment. Social media amplifies this. The bypasser posts about his meditation practice, his plant-based diet, his morning routine. He gets validation for the performance while his actual life crumbles in private. How it masquerades as progress. The bypasser looks healed. He's done therapy. He's read the books. He can articulate his wounds without breaking down. But healing isn't the same as integration. You haven't integrated your father wound if you can't feel the grief. You haven't integrated your rage if it never moves through your body. You haven't transcended attachment if you're using transcendence to avoid intimacy. Jung's test for this pattern: can you access your emotions in real time, in relationships, under pressure? Or does your peace require controlled environments and distance from real life? Pattern 2, the warrior addict. Discipline equals freedom. Weakness is the enemy. No days off. The warrior addict is the opposite of the bypasser and exactly the same. He channels everything into discipline, achievement, and conquest. He wakes at 4 a.m., trains hard, works harder. His body is a machine. His schedule is optimized. His goals are aggressive. He looks powerful, but he can't stop, because stopping means feeling. The warrior pattern is seductive because it delivers results. You set a goal, you achieve it. You want to build muscle, you lift. You want to make money, you work. The external world responds to warrior energy. You get respect, admiration, success. But internally, you're running from something. Usually vulnerability, grief, or the terror of your own softness. Jung saw this in combat veterans, high-performing executives, and athletes who drove themselves to breakdown. They'd achieved everything society defines as success, but they couldn't rest, couldn't relax, couldn't be tender without feeling weak. One patient told Jung, "If I stop pushing, I'll disappear." That's the warrior's core terror. Without achievement, I am nothing. The mechanism. The warrior uses intensity as anesthesia. When you're training at maximal intensity, you can't think. When you're working 80-hour weeks, you can't feel. When you're constantly conquering new goals, you don't have to sit with the emptiness. The problem? The goals never satisfy. You achieve one, feel briefly fulfilled, then immediately need a harder challenge. It's addiction, just socially acceptable. Jung identified this as inflation by the archetype. The man isn't embodying warrior energy, he's possessed by it. The archetype runs him, instead of him wielding it consciously. The relational cost. The warrior addict struggles with intimacy because intimacy requires receptivity. He can provide, protect, solve problems, but he can't be vulnerable, can't admit weakness, can't ask for help without feeling shame. His partner often says, "I feel like a project you're managing, not a person you're connecting with." His children admire his discipline but fear his intensity. They learn that love equals performance, rest equals weakness, and he's modeling the same pattern that will eventually break them. The shadow motivation. What's he avoiding? Usually the grief of never being seen for who he is, only what he achieves. Often there's a father who only showed approval through performance. The warrior learned early, if you're not producing, you're worthless. So he keeps producing, and the psyche exhausts itself, trying to fill a void that achievement can never satisfy. The crash. The warrior addict either burns out or becomes tyrannical. Burnout looks like sudden collapse, injury, illness, depression, breakdown. The body revolts against the relentless intensity. Tyranny looks like turning warrior energy outward, demanding the same discipline from others, shaming weakness, creating toxic cultures of performance. Both are the psyche's compensation for one-sided development. How it masquerades as progress society rewards warriors. They're productive, reliable, high-performing, but productivity isn't the same as wholeness. Jung's test: can you rest without guilt? Can you be tender without feeling weak? Can you fail without collapsing into shame? If not, you're not a grounded warrior. You're addicted to intensity to avoid feeling. Pattern 3. The guru-disciple. My teacher says, according to the tradition, I'm following the path. The guru-disciple outsources his sovereignty to teachers, systems, and ideologies. He's devoted, committed, follows the practices perfectly, quotes his teacher extensively, defends the tradition against criticism. He looks like the perfect student. But he's avoiding personal responsibility. Jung encountered this pattern constantly. Patients who'd spent decades with the same analyst, always on the verge of breakthrough but never quite arriving. Or men who moved from teacher to teacher, system to system, always seeking the one who would finally give them the answer. The pattern reveals itself in the language. My teacher says I should. The tradition requires. I'm not ready yet. There's always an external authority making the decisions. The mechanism. The disciple discovered early that following authority feels safe. Someone else holds the burden of uncertainty. Someone else knows what's right. He doesn't have to face the existential terror of autonomy, the recognition that ultimately you are responsible for your own life. So he submits, not in the healthy way initiation requires, but in perpetual adolescence. He's the eternal student never graduating into adult sovereignty, the shadow motivation. What's he avoiding? Usually his own power, the terror of what might happen if he stopped following and started leading his own life. Often there's a history of being shamed for autonomous decisions, a parent who punished independence, a culture that demanded conformity. He learned, trust yourself and you'll be punished. Follow authority and you'll be safe. The spiritual materialism. The disciple collects credentials, initiations, and lineages like armor. He's been initiated into 3 traditions, studied with 5 teachers, completed 7 levels of training, but he still doesn't trust his own knowing, because the credentials aren't about wisdom, they're about avoiding the responsibility of sovereignty. The relational pattern. The disciple often seeks partners who will mother him or tell him what to do. He's attracted to strong, decisive people who will carry the burden of choice. Then he resents them for controlling him. Without recognizing he invited the dynamic. Or he seeks partners who also want to be disciples, and they become codependent spiritual seekers, following systems together while both avoiding adult responsibility. How it masquerades as progress devotion looks like humility. Following a path looks like discipline, but there's a difference between healthy apprenticeship and avoiding sovereignty. Jung's test. Can you disagree with your teacher? Can you trust your own knowing even when it contradicts the system? Can you graduate from student to peer? If not, you're not devoted, you're dependent. Pattern 4. The victim mystic. This suffering is purifying me. My pain has purpose. I'm being tested. The victim mystic has discovered the most seductive spiritual bypass of all, suffering as identity. He's been through trauma, real trauma, and he's done the initial work of naming it, feeling it, processing it. But then he stopped, because victim identity, once established, provides powerful secondary gains: sympathy, attention, the moral high ground, permission to not fully show up in life. Jung identified this in patients who were perpetually in crisis. Every session brought new catastrophe. Every week brought fresh wounds. When Jung would note patterns, how the patient seemed to attract the same situations repeatedly, they'd respond with hurt. You don't understand how hard my life is. And Jung would say, I understand completely. The question is, what are you getting from staying in this story? The mechanism. The victim mystic spiritualizes suffering to avoid healing. This is my dharma. This is clearing karma. God is testing me. The universe is preparing me for my purpose. These frameworks aren't wrong. Suffering can be transformative, but he's using them to make suffering permanent. Because healing means losing the identity, the narrative, the familiar role, and that's terrifying. The shadow motivation. What's he avoiding? Usually his own agency, the recognition that while he didn't cause his trauma, he is responsible for his healing. Often there's a history of genuine powerlessness, childhood abuse, systemic oppression, real victimization, but he's taken that experience and made it his entire identity, resisting any suggestion that he could move through it. The spiritual addiction. The victim mystic is addicted to the story of his suffering. He's done every healing modality: therapy, bodywork, plant medicine, energy healing, past life regression. Each one confirms his wounds, validates his pain, explains his struggles. But he doesn't actually heal, because healing would mean outgrowing the story. Jung noticed that some patients became expert at therapeutic language, using it not to transform but to cement their victim narrative. I can't be in relationship because of my attachment trauma. I can't work a normal job because of my ADHD. I can't set boundaries because of my people-pleasing. Every psychological insight becomes a reason why life is impossible. The relational pattern. The victim mystic attracts caretakers and fixers, people who want to save him. Initially, this feels like love. Someone finally sees his pain and wants to help. But over time, the caretaker exhausts themselves. They realize nothing they do is enough. He's not actually interested in healing. He's interested in being saved. When they pull back, he finds a new savior, and the pattern repeats. How it masquerades as progress. The victim mystic looks like he's doing deep work. He's always in therapy, always processing, always aware of his wounds. But awareness without agency is paralysis. Jung's test: are you healing or rehearsing? Are you processing your trauma or performing it? Are you moving through your pain or building a fortress around it? Pattern 5. The intellectual dissociator. Let me explain the neuroscience of that. According to research, Jung said, the intellectual dissociator has mastered every spiritual concept, but can't feel a single emotion. He can explain shadow work, cite attachment theory, articulate non-dual philosophy, and reference the latest neuroscience. He's brilliant, articulate, impressive, and completely disembodied. Jung encountered this constantly in academic and intellectual circles, men who could teach psychology but couldn't have an authentic conversation, who understood trauma theoretically but couldn't access their own. One patient could explain his mother complex with stunning precision, Jungian theory, object relations, attachment styles. Jung listened, then asked, "What do you actually feel about your mother?" The patient went blank. "I just explained it." "You explained the concept. I'm asking what you feel." Long silence. Then, "I don't know." The mechanism. The dissociator uses intellect as a defense against embodiment. When emotions arise, he immediately conceptualizes them. This is just my inner child. This is my nervous system dysregulation. This is the ego defending itself. The analysis is accurate, but the feeling never lands. He's in his head, observing his life from a safe distance. The shadow motivation. What's he avoiding? Usually the vulnerability of not knowing, the terror of being in his body, where emotions live and can't be controlled. Often there's childhood trauma where the body wasn't safe, abuse, neglect, or overwhelming chaos. He learned to escape into the mind. The intellect became his refuge, and now it's his prison, the spiritual library. The dissociator has read every book, taken every course, can quote every teacher, but he hasn't integrated any of it. Because integration requires descending from concept into embodiment, and his entire defense structure is built on staying above the body. Jung noticed these patients could have profound intellectual breakthroughs in session. Yes, that's it, I see the pattern, but nothing changed behaviorally. The insight lived in the head. It never reached the heart or body, the relational pattern. The dissociator's partners complain, "I feel like I'm talking to a therapist, not a human being." He can analyze the relationship dynamics, explain attachment patterns, discuss communication styles, but he can't just be present, can't hold his partner without making it about technique, can't have sex without observing his performance. Everything is mediated through analysis, and it's profoundly lonely for both people. How it masquerades as progress. The dissociator looks wise. He has all the language, all the frameworks, but wisdom isn't knowledge. It's embodied understanding. Jung's test. Can you feel before you think? Can you be in your body without narrating the experience? Can you connect with someone without analyzing them? If not, you're not wise, you're defended. Pattern 6, the transcendence junkie. That breathwork ceremony changed my life. I finally saw God. I need to do another retreat. The transcendence junkie is addicted to peak experiences. He chases altered states through retreats, ceremonies, extreme practices, psychedelics, anything that delivers the feeling of breakthrough. And he does have breakthroughs, real ones, profound mystical experiences where the ego dissolves and he touches something vast. But then he returns to ordinary life and can't sustain the integration, so he needs another hit. Jung identified this in patients who'd had multiple awakening experiences, but whose lives were chaotic disasters, relationships failing, finances unstable, health declining. But I've been to 12 ayahuasca ceremonies. One patient told him, "I've seen the truth." Have you? Jung asked. Or have you seen truth and then returned to the lie of your daily life? The mechanism. The junkie discovered that peak experiences feel like transformation. The ego dissolves, bliss arrives, unity consciousness emerges, and for a few hours, days, or weeks afterward, he feels different. But he hasn't done the work of integration, bringing that expanded consciousness into his relationships, sexuality, work, and ordinary moments. So the peak fades, and he needs another one. It's addiction, just dressed in spiritual language. The shadow motivation. What's he avoiding? Usually the boring, difficult, unglamorous work of daily practice and relational accountability. Peak experiences are exciting. Integration is mundane. It's easier to have ego death in ceremony than to show up vulnerable in marriage. Easier to dissolve into cosmic consciousness than to do your dishes with presence. So he keeps seeking transcendence because the alternative is being fully human, which feels disappointing after tasting the divine. The crash, the junkie either fragments or plateaus. Fragmentation happens when peak experiences accumulate without integration. The psyche can't hold the expanded states and cracks. Paranoia, delusion, spiritual emergency. Plateauing happens when the experiences stop working. He's done so many ceremonies, so many retreats, that they no longer deliver the high. He's chasing a memory of his first awakening. Both outcomes reveal the pattern. He was using transcendence to escape immanence. The relational cost. The junkie's partners feel abandoned every time he leaves for another retreat. He returns transformed, makes promises of change, then slowly reverts to old patterns. Over time, they stop believing the transformation is real, because it's not. Real transformation shows up in how you treat people when you're not feeling blissful. How it masquerades as progress. The junkie looks deeply committed. He's always seeking, always growing, always going deeper. But spiritual materialism isn't depth, it's avoidance. Jung's test. Can you be present to ordinary life with the same reverence you bring to ceremony? Can you integrate your insights into daily behavior? Can you sustain connection without needing peak experiences? If not, you're not awakening, you're escaping. Pattern 7, the savior complex. I'm here to wake people up. Someone has to do this work. They need me. The savior complex is the most insidious pattern because it looks like service. He's helping, teaching, healing, leading groups, offering guidance, showing up for others. And he is genuinely helping, to a point. But underneath, he's using service to avoid his own wounds. Jung saw this in therapists who worked with everyone's trauma but never touched their own. In spiritual teachers who guided others to awakening while their personal lives were disasters, in men who'd save broken women, exhausting themselves trying to fix what wasn't theirs to fix. One patient ran a men's group, led retreats, and mentored dozens of younger men. Jung asked him, "When was the last time you were vulnerable with someone who couldn't give you anything back?" The man couldn't answer. His service was transactional. He gave so he could receive validation, purpose, identity, the mechanism. The Savior uses others' problems to avoid his own. When you're focused on fixing someone else, you don't have to face your own brokenness. When you're the teacher, the healer, the guide, you don't have to be the student anymore. The role provides identity, purpose, and protection from genuine vulnerability. The shadow motivation. What's he avoiding? Usually, his own need for help. The terror of admitting he doesn't have it all together. Often there's childhood role reversal. He became the parent's therapist, the family savior, the one who held it together while everyone else fell apart. He learned, your value is in what you give, not who you are. So he keeps giving and exhausts himself and resents the people he's helping because the real need to be seen, helped, held, never gets met. The inflation, the savior, often develops spiritual inflation, unconscious identification with the healer archetype. He starts believing he's more evolved than others, that he sees what they can't see, that he has a special mission, a higher calling. Jung called this identification with the self, the ego inflating to archetypal proportions. It looks like confidence, it's actually compensation for deep inadequacy. The relational pattern. The savior attracts people who need saving, victims, addicts, the wounded. Initially, this feels purposeful. He's using his gifts. He's making a difference. But over time, he realizes he's attracted to people who will never fully heal, because if they did, he'd lose his role. And the relationship either codependent or collapses when he runs out of energy to give. The burnout. Eventually, the savior exhausts himself. He's been giving from his wounds, not his overflow. The burnout often presents as compassion fatigue, but Jung saw it differently. It's the psyche's rebellion against using service to avoid personal work. When the savior can no longer save, he crashes into his own unmet needs, and the rage, grief, and emptiness he's been avoiding through service finally surfaces. How it masquerades as progress. The savior looks enlightened. He's selfless, generous, devoted to others. But service from wounds creates dependency. True service, what Jung called individuation in service of the collective, comes from wholeness, not need. Jung's test: can you stop helping without losing your sense of purpose? Can you receive help without shame? Can you witness someone's pain without trying to fix it? If not, you're not serving, you're avoiding yourself. The pattern beneath the patterns. Here's what Jung ultimately discovered. All 7 patterns serve the same function. They're defenses against the ego death required for genuine initiation. The bypasser transcends. The warrior achieves, the disciple follows, the victim suffers, the dissociator analyzes, the junkie seeks peaks, the savior rescues, different strategies, same avoidance. And most men don't cycle through one. They cycle through multiple, often simultaneously. You might be a warrior at work, a bypasser in relationships, and a dissociator in therapy. The question isn't which pattern you have, it's which pattern is running your life right now, and are you willing to see it? Because recognition is the first crack in the defense. Once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it. And that seeing creates possibility for something different. Not perfection, not elimination of the pattern, but consciousness, choice. The ability to recognize when you're defending and choose dissent instead. That's where real individuation begins. Jung didn't warn about these patterns to shame men. He warned because he saw, clinically, repeatedly, devastatingly, what happens when men remain trapped in unconscious spiritual patterns for decades. The psyche doesn't tolerate one-sided development indefinitely. It compensates, it revolts. It creates symptoms so severe you're forced to pay attention. And if you still refuse, it destroys you. Let's examine the 5 escalating dangers of staying stuck in these patterns without progression toward genuine initiation. Danger 1. Psychological fragmentation. The first danger is internal. Your psyche begins fragmenting. Jung called this dissociation of the personality, the splitting of consciousness into incompatible parts that can't communicate or integrate. Here's what it looks like. The spiritual bypasser meditates peacefully in the morning, then rages at his family at night, with no awareness of the contradiction. The warrior achieves massive success at work, while his body breaks down from stress-related illness, and he can't connect the two. The guru-disciple devotes himself to his teacher's path while secretly resenting every demand, but can't acknowledge the resentment without shattering his identity. The victim mystic preaches self-responsibility while blaming everyone else for his pain, without seeing the hypocrisy. The intellectual dissociator explains trauma healing while having panic attacks, unable to apply his knowledge to himself. The transcendence junkie has mystical experiences of unity while treating people like objects. The peak experience disconnected from daily behavior. The savior complex saves everyone else while falling apart in private, his public persona completely divorced from his private reality. This fragmentation creates what Jung called symptoms, not in the medical sense, but as the psyche's language. Depression isn't just sadness. It's the psyche saying the way you're living is unsustainable. Anxiety isn't just nervousness. It's the body screaming, you're ignoring something essential. Addiction isn't just craving. It's the compensatory attempt to feel what you've been suppressing. Psychosomatic illness, chronic pain, autoimmune disorders, mysterious symptoms is the body expressing what the mind refuses to acknowledge. Jung treated patients whose bodies were literally breaking down because they wouldn't break down psychologically. The ego refused transformation, so the body forced it. One patient developed crippling back pain that no medical intervention could cure. Through analysis, Jung discovered the pain appeared whenever the man had to say no to his boss, his wife, his obligations. His body was doing what his psyche couldn't, refusing the burden. The pain disappeared when he learned to set boundaries consciously. But without that intervention, the fragmentation would have continued, creating new symptoms, more severe illnesses, until something catastrophic forced reckoning. Let me tell you something Jung discovered that terrified him. It wasn't about trauma. It wasn't about childhood wounds. It was about what happens to men who never complete their psychological initiation, men who remain trapped in spiritual patterns without ever breaking through to wholeness. He called it the self's revenge, and he watched it destroy brilliant men, one by one, throughout his career. Here's what most spiritual teachers won't tell you. These patterns don't just hold you back. They actively destroy you. They fragment your psyche, dissolve your relationships, collapse your meaning structures, and ultimately turn you into a force of chaos in the world. Jung wasn't being dramatic. He was being clinical. He documented 5 escalating dangers that manifest when men refuse the initiatory descent. 5 predictable consequences that show up with mathematical precision in the lives of uninitiated men. And if you're watching this right now, some of these are already happening in your life. Danger 1. Psychological fragmentation. The first danger is psychological fragmentation, the slow disintegration of the personality when the ego refuses to integrate rejected parts of the psyche. Jung observed this pattern repeatedly in his practice. A man comes in with anxiety, then depression, then psychosomatic illness, migraines, chronic pain, digestive issues that have no medical explanation. His body is screaming what his mind refuses to acknowledge. This isn't random. This is the self's revenge. When you suppress your shadow, your rage, your shame, your desire, your weakness, it doesn't disappear. It goes underground. It lodges itself in your nervous system, your dreams, your physical body. The intellectual dissociator develops crippling anxiety because his body is trying to force him to feel what he's been analyzing from a distance. The transcendence junkie cycles through addiction, to meditation, to peak experiences, to spiritual bypassing, because the unlived life keeps demanding expression. Jung called this compensation. The psyche automatically tries to restore balance. If you're living one-sided, all mind and no body, all spirit and no shadow, all independence and no intimacy, the unconscious will begin producing symptoms to force the correction. At first, it's subtle. You feel vaguely dissatisfied, restless, like something's missing, but you can't name it. Then it escalates. Depression sets in, not the kind that responds to positive thinking, but the existential kind that whispers, "Nothing matters," at 3 a.m. Anxiety becomes constant background noise. Your body starts breaking down in ways doctors can't explain. This is your psyche fragmenting under the pressure of repression. Jung treated a patient, a professor, brilliant man, lived entirely in his head, who developed such severe digestive issues he couldn't eat solid food for months. Medical tests showed nothing, but in analysis they discovered he'd spent decades swallowing his rage at his father, never expressing it, never integrating it. The body was literalizing what the mind refused to process. Within 6 months of shadow work, actively engaging with his repressed anger through active imagination and somatic practice, his digestion normalized completely. The symptom wasn't the problem. The symptom was the solution trying to break through. But here's what makes this dangerous. Most men don't make the connection. They treat the symptom. Antidepressants for the depression, anxiety medication for the panic, pain pills for the migraines, therapy that reinforces the pattern rather than confronting it. The spiritual bypasser meditates harder. The warrior addict pushes through with more discipline. The intellectual dissociator analyzes his symptoms from a distance, creating elaborate theories about why he feels this way. And the fragmentation deepens, because here's the truth Jung discovered: you cannot think your way out of this. You cannot transcend your way out. You cannot discipline your way out. The only way through is integration, bringing what's been rejected back into conscious relationship. The psychiatric research on this is clear. Men who suppress emotional expression have significantly higher rates of cardiovascular disease, autoimmune disorders, and early mortality. The body keeps the score. Dr. Gabor Mate's work on trauma and illness shows that repressed emotions, especially rage and grief, create chronic inflammation and dysregulation in the nervous system. This isn't mystical. This is physiology. Your psyche is not separate from your body. When you fragment psychologically, you fragment somatically. And the longer you stay in these patterns, the more entrenched the fragmentation becomes. Jung saw men in their 40s and 50s who'd spent decades in one pattern, and their personalities had literally split. They couldn't access their own emotions. They couldn't connect with their bodies. They lived entirely in personas, masks they wore for the world, with nothing real underneath. This is psychological death before physical death. You become a hollow man, performing a role, going through motions, but there's no one home. Your wife looks at you and doesn't recognize you. Your children feel the emotional void. Your friends experience you as unavailable. You're fragmenting, and everyone around you can feel it, even if they can't name it. Danger 2. Relational destruction. The second danger is relational destruction. Uninitiated men cannot sustain mature intimacy. Full stop. Jung was explicit about this. He said the greatest tragedy of modern masculinity is that men are relationally stunted, unable to move beyond either domination or submission, control or collapse, neediness or avoidance, and this destroys everything they touch. Let's be specific about what this looks like. The warrior addict enters relationships as conquests. He pursues intensely, wins the woman, then either loses interest or becomes controlling. He cannot allow vulnerability. He cannot surrender to partnership. Every interaction becomes about power dynamics. His relationships follow a pattern: intense beginning, growing distance, eventual explosion or withdrawal. He cycles through partners, always blaming them, never recognizing the pattern is his. The victim martyr does the opposite, but with the same result. He enters relationships as the wounded one who needs saving. He's emotionally available, but in a collapsing, needy way that exhausts his partner. Every conflict becomes about his pain. Every disagreement triggers his abandonment wound. His relationships follow a different pattern: initial sympathy from partner, growing resentment at his victimhood, eventual exhaustion and departure. He cycles through partners, always feeling abandoned, never recognizing he's recreating the pattern. The intellectual dissociator cannot do intimacy at all. He analyzes his partner rather than feeling her. He has theories about relationships, but no capacity for emotional presence. Sex becomes mechanical or charged with unconscious projections he won't examine. His relationships are emotionally sterile. His partner feels unseen, unmet, like she's living with a robot. Eventually she leaves, or they settle into dead companionship. Roommates with a history, nothing more. The spiritual bypasser uses spirituality to avoid relational depth. "We're all one" becomes an excuse not to deal with conflict. Attachment is suffering becomes justification for emotional unavailability. He's loving in the abstract but absent in the specific. His relationships feel transcendent at first: spiritual connection, deep conversations, but hollow over time. There's no real intimacy because he won't descend into the messy, embodied reality of two separate people trying to be together. Jung said this explicitly: the meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed. But uninitiated men cannot allow this transformation. They cannot allow the relationship to change them, because change threatens the pattern they're using to avoid their wounds. So they destroy the relationship to preserve the pattern. This happens unconsciously. They're not trying to sabotage love. They're protecting themselves from the initiatory ordeal that real intimacy demands. Because here's what mature intimacy requires: you must allow yourself to be seen, shadow and all. You must allow yourself to be changed by another. You must hold the tension between autonomy and connection without collapsing into either. Uninitiated men cannot do this. The research on this is devastating. John Gottman's decades of studying relationships shows that the #1 predictor of divorce isn't conflict, it's emotional unavailability in men. The inability to turn toward their partner's emotional bids, the refusal to be vulnerable. Esther Perel's work on modern relationships reveals that men oscillate between two extremes: domination, the alpha myth, or submission, the nice guy trap. Both are defensive patterns. Neither is mature masculinity, and both destroy intimacy, because intimacy requires integration, the capacity to be strong and vulnerable, independent and connected, protective and surrendered. It requires you to have done the inner work of integrating opposites, which means you cannot have a mature relationship until you've undergone psychological initiation. Jung treated countless men whose relationships were destroyed by their patterns. One case stays with me. A successful businessman, warrior pattern, married 15 years. His wife asked for a divorce, and he was genuinely confused. I provided for her. I protected her. What more does she want? What she wanted was him, the real him, beneath the warrior mask. She wanted emotional presence, vulnerability, the capacity to be affected by her. She wanted partnership, not provision. She wanted a man who'd done his inner work, not a role he was performing. He couldn't give it because he didn't have access to it. His entire identity was built on being the strong provider. Any vulnerability felt like death. Any emotion felt like weakness. So the marriage ended, and he cycled into the pattern with his next partner, and the next, always wondering why it never worked. Here's what makes this danger so insidious. You can go decades without recognizing it. You tell yourself the relationships failed because of incompatibility, bad timing, her issues. You construct elaborate narratives that preserve your self-image while avoiding the pattern. But the pattern keeps playing out. Different partners, same outcome. And eventually, if you're paying attention, you realize the common variable is you. You're bringing the same uninitiated, fragmented, defended self into every relationship, expecting different results. Danger. 3. Existential despair. The third danger is existential despair, the collapse of all previous meanings that Jung called the midlife crisis, but is actually an initiatory crisis. This usually hits between 35 and 50, though it can come earlier or later. And for men trapped in spiritual patterns without genuine initiation, this crisis becomes truly dangerous. Suicide ideation increases dramatically. Reckless behavior escalates. Everything that once gave life meaning suddenly feels hollow. Let me describe what this actually feels like. You wake up one day and realize the career you built means nothing. The spiritual practices you've been doing feel empty. The relationships you're in feel like performances. The person you thought you were feels like a stranger. It's not depression. It's deeper than that. It's the recognition that you've been living someone else's life, that you've been performing a role rather than becoming a self, that everything you've achieved, accumulated, or attained has been in service of avoiding the one thing that actually matters, your own psychological wholeness. Jung called this the confrontation with the self. It's when the ego's game is exposed and the psyche demands real initiation. Not spiritual experiences, not accomplishments, not another pattern to hide in. Real descent into the underworld of your own rejected psyche. The transcendence junkie hits this wall when all the peak experiences stop working. He's meditated, plant medicined, workshop hopped, and guru followed for years, and suddenly none of it touches the emptiness inside. He realizes he's been spiritually bypassing his actual life. The intellectual dissociator hits it when all his theories fail to provide meaning. He's understood everything, analyzed everything, but understanding doesn't fill the void. He's in his head while his soul is starving. The warrior addict hits it when victory stops satisfying. Another deal closed, another goal achieved, another conquest completed, and the feeling lasts maybe a day. Then the emptiness returns, demanding more. The victim martyr hits it when suffering stops being meaningful. His identity has been built on his wounds, but suddenly carrying them feels pointless. What has all this suffering been for? This is the dark night of the soul that mystics write about, but Jung understood it psychologically. It's not a spiritual crisis, it's a developmental crisis. Your psyche is trying to force you into initiation because you've been avoiding it through patterns. The ego structure you've built is collapsing because it was never meant to be permanent. It was supposed to be a stage you moved through on the way to wholeness, but you got stuck. You mistook the pattern for the path. You confused spiritual experiences with psychological integration, and now the self is dismantling everything to force the real work. Jung was clear about this. The midlife crisis is not about buying a sports car or having an affair. Those are symptoms. The real crisis is existential. Who am I beyond my roles, my achievements, my spiritual identity? And for men who've been avoiding this question through patterns, the answer is terrifying. I don't know. There's nothing underneath the mask, no solid self, just a collection of defensive strategies and personas. This is where suicide ideation spikes, not because life is unbearable, but because continuing to live the false life feels unbearable. The thought isn't "I want to die" so much as "this version of me needs to die." Jung called this ego death, the necessary dissolution of the false self so the true self can emerge. But if you don't understand what's happening, if you're not supported through it, if you try to resist it by doubling down on the pattern, this is when men self-destruct. The statistics are stark. Suicide rates for men peak in middle age, particularly in the 45-54 demographic. This isn't coincidental. This is the initiatory crisis hitting men who have no framework for understanding it and no elders to guide them through it. Modern culture offers no initiation, so the psyche forces it through crisis, and men either break down or break through. The difference is whether you understand what's happening and surrender to the process, or whether you resist it and fragment further. I've seen this firsthand. Men in their 40s who seem successful on paper, but are suicidal inside. The CEO who's built an empire but feels it means nothing. The spiritual teacher who's enlightened everyone but himself. The professor who's mastered knowledge but lost touch with life. One patient Jung treated, documented in his case files, was a 47-year-old physician who'd spent his entire career helping others while avoiding his own psyche. Successful practice, respected in his field, but spiritually dead inside. He came to Jung with suicidal thoughts that terrified him. He couldn't explain them. His life looked perfect from outside. Jung told him, "These aren't thoughts about ending your life. They're thoughts about ending this false life. Your psyche is trying to kill the persona so the real person can be born." That reframe changed everything. The patient stopped resisting and began descending into his shadow, his wounds, his unlived potential. The suicidal thoughts transformed into the death they actually were, the death of the false self. Within 2 years, he'd left his practice, retrained in a field he actually cared about, ended a dead marriage, and began genuine individuation work. He didn't die. He was reborn. Danger. 4. Spiritual inflation or deflation. The fourth danger is the polarization Jung called inflation and deflation, two opposite extremes that uninitiated men oscillate between, both preventing grounded living. Inflation, believing you're special, chosen, enlightened, a savior. Your ego identifies with archetypal energies and you lose touch with your humanity. Deflation, believing you're worthless, broken, beyond help, that nothing matters. Your ego collapses into nihilism and you lose touch with your potential. Both are defenses against the real work. Let's start with inflation because it's more seductive and dangerous. The spiritual bypasser, after years of practice, starts believing he's transcended the human condition. He's not like other people. He's awakened. He sees through the illusion. He's beyond ego, beyond shadow, beyond the need for integration. This is the guru complex Jung warned about. The man starts teaching before he's integrated. He gathers followers. He creates a spiritual identity that feeds his ego while claiming to be egoless. He projects divinity onto himself and loses touch with his humanity. Jung called this identification with the archetype. Instead of relating to archetypal energies consciously, the ego merges with them and becomes inflated. The savior crusader does this constantly. He believes he's here to fix the world, save humanity, Be the chosen one who will lead others to enlightenment. His mission becomes grandiose. His sense of importance becomes inflated. He's not serving from groundedness. He's compensating for inner emptiness with outer inflation. Here's why this is dangerous. Inflated men cause tremendous damage. They create cults of personality. They exploit vulnerable people. They abuse power while claiming spiritual authority. They sexually, financially, or emotionally harm others while justifying it through their special status. Jung documented this repeatedly. Every abusive guru, every cult leader, every spiritual narcissist is an example of inflation. Ego identifying with archetypal energies without integration. You've seen this. The meditation teacher who sleeps with students, the life coach who's a financial predator, the spiritual leader who creates dependency rather than empowerment. These aren't bad people. They're uninitiated people, trapped in patterns inflated by archetypal identification, dangerous precisely because they believe they're enlightened. The research on narcissistic spiritual leaders shows a common pattern. Early trauma, spiritual seeking, peak experiences that inflate the ego, creation of following, gradual corruption, eventual exposure, and collapse. What's missing is genuine initiation, the descent that deflates the ego and integrates the shadow before the person starts teaching. Jung insisted on this. You cannot guide others through territory you haven't traversed yourself. You cannot initiate others if you haven't been initiated. But inflated men believe they can. They skip the descent and go straight to the mountaintop, where they become dangerous. Now, deflation, the opposite, but equally problematic extreme. This is the collapse into nihilism, worthlessness, meaninglessness. It often follows inflation when the guru complex fails or when the spiritual identity shatters. The man who believed he was special now believes he's worthless. The one who thought he was enlightened now thinks he's broken beyond repair. The one who was saving the world now thinks nothing matters. This is ego collapse, the shadow of inflation. The victim martyr lives here permanently. His identity is built on being damaged, suffering, unable to change. Any movement toward empowerment feels threatening because it would mean giving up the victim identity. The intellectual dissociator ends up here when his theories fail. He concludes that since understanding doesn't fix him, nothing will. He deflates into cynicism and nihilism. Jung treated a patient who oscillated between these extremes his entire adult life. In his 20s, inflated, believed he was a prophetic voice who'd change culture, wrote manifestos, gathered followers, created movements. By his 30s, deflated, all his projects had failed, his followers left. He concluded he was delusional and worthless, fell into years of depression and withdrawal. In his 40s, inflated again, discovered a new spiritual system, believed he'd found the answer, started teaching, gathered a new following. By his 50s, another deflation, the pattern exposed, the relationship destroyed, the meaning collapsed. He came to Jung suicidal, convinced he was fundamentally broken, oscillating between extremes his whole life with no solid ground. Jung's work with him was about finding the middle, neither inflated nor deflated but human, neither special nor worthless but real, neither guru nor victim but an ordinary man doing the work of integration. Here's the key. Both inflation and deflation are defenses against ordinariness. Being simply human, flawed, limited, mortal, neither special nor worthless, requires more courage than either extreme. Inflation lets you avoid your shadow by claiming transcendence. Deflation lets you avoid your potential by claiming brokenness. Both keep you from the real work, becoming who you actually are, neither inflated nor deflated, but integrated. Danger 5. Collective harm. The fifth and most dangerous consequence. Uninitiated men create destructive systems that harm others and perpetuate trauma across generations. This is what Jung meant when he said, uninitiated men are the most dangerous force in civilization. They don't just hurt themselves. They project their inner chaos outward and create external chaos in their families, workplaces, communities, and culture. Let's be specific about what this looks like. In families, uninitiated fathers pass their wounds to their children. The warrior addict raises sons who either replicate his aggressive dominance or collapse into passive avoidance. His daughters learn that men are emotionally unavailable or that love requires submission. The pattern transmits intergenerationally. His children's children inherit the wound. The cycle continues until someone breaks it through conscious initiation. In workplaces, uninitiated men create toxic cultures. The warrior addict builds companies through domination, exploitation, and ruthless competition. The savior crusader creates mission-driven organizations that burn out employees through unrealistic expectations and moral inflation. The intellectual dissociator creates sterile, bureaucratic systems where human connection dies. The spiritual bypasser creates conscious companies that are actually cults of personality with meditation breaks. In politics and leadership, this is where uninitiated masculinity becomes most dangerous. Authoritarian leaders are almost always uninitiated men, projecting their father wounds onto the nation, their shadow onto enemies, their need for power onto governance. Hitler is the clearest example Jung analyzed. A profoundly wounded man, savior complex inflated to genocidal proportions, shadow projected onto entire populations, creating systematic destruction because of his own psychological fragmentation. But this pattern repeats at every level. The boss who rules through fear, the leader who demands loyalty while offering none, the authority figure who abuses power because he's never integrated his own weakness. Uninitiated men create dominance hierarchies, not leadership structures. They exploit rather than serve. They take rather than give. They destroy rather than build. In relationships with women, uninitiated men perpetuate violence, physical, emotional, sexual, psychological. This isn't about demonizing masculinity. This is about recognizing that men who haven't integrated their shadow, their anima, their wounds, cannot relate to women maturely. They either idealize projection of anima onto a woman who can never live up to it, or degrade projection of shadow onto women who become targets of repressed rage and shame. The statistics are clear. Domestic violence, sexual assault, emotional abuse are overwhelmingly perpetrated by men, and the common thread is uninitiated masculinity, men who haven't done the inner work and act out their psychic fragmentation on women's bodies and psyches. Jung was explicit. Until a man has integrated his anima, his inner feminine, he cannot relate to outer women without projection, possession, or violation. In culture and environment, uninitiated men create extractive, exploitative systems. Why is our relationship with nature one of domination rather than partnership? Because uninitiated masculinity projects its need for control onto the natural world. The environmental crisis is fundamentally a crisis of uninitiated masculine consciousness. The belief that we can exploit without consequence, dominate without relationship, extract without reciprocity. This is psychological projection on a planetary scale. The warrior addict approaches nature as conquest. The intellectual dissociator views it as resource to be managed. The transcendence junkie escapes into mystical identification with nature while ignoring actual ecological responsibility. None of them relate to nature as alive, conscious, worthy of respect on its own terms, because they haven't learned to relate to their own inner nature that way. Jung's warning was clear. The meeting with oneself is, at first, the meeting with one's own shadow. The shadow is a tight passage, a narrow door, whose painful constriction no one is spared who goes down to the deep well. But one must learn to know oneself in order to know who one is. And then he added, for what comes after the door is, surprisingly enough, a boundless expanse full of unprecedented uncertainty, with apparently no inside and no outside, no above and no below, no here and no there, no mine and no thine, no good and no bad. In other words, until you've integrated your shadow, you project it onto the world. You create enemies where there are none, threats where there's only uncertainty, evil where there's only unconsciousness. Uninitiated men make the world dangerous because they are dangerous, not because they're evil, but because they're unconscious. I want you to understand the scale of this. Every war, every genocide, every authoritarian regime, every exploitative corporation, every cult, every abuse system, trace it back far enough and you find uninitiated men at the center. Not because masculinity is inherently destructive, but because uninitiated masculinity becomes destructive when it gains power without wisdom, authority without integration, influence without grounding. The solution isn't to eliminate masculine power, it's to initiate men so their power becomes generative rather than destructive, protective rather than dominating, wise rather than reactive. This is why Jung devoted his life to this work. He understood that individual psychology and collective well-being are inseparable. When one man integrates his shadow, it affects his family, his workplace, his community. When enough men do this work, culture changes, systems change, consciousness evolves. But when men remain uninitiated, trapped in patterns, projecting chaos, creating destruction, the collective suffers. Children inherit trauma. Women bear the brunt of violence. Culture stagnates in reactivity and polarization. The work of masculine initiation is not just personal development, it's collective necessity, which brings us to the critical question, what now? You've seen the patterns, you've felt the dangers. Maybe you recognize yourself in these descriptions. Maybe you're terrified by what you're realizing about your own life. Good. That fear is the beginning of wisdom, because now we turn to Jung's solution. Not another system to hide in, not another pattern to adopt, but the developmental blueprint for becoming a whole human being. The path of individuation, the road of conscious initiation, the journey that transforms boys into men and men into elders. But before we get to the solution, I need you to understand something crucial. Jung himself wasn't immune to these patterns. He fell into them. He struggled with them. He nearly destroyed himself navigating them. And that's what makes his solution so powerful. It came from lived experience, not theory, from descent and return, not academic speculation. So in the next section, we'll explore Jung's own journey through the underworld, his confrontation with the unconscious, his near psychotic break, his emergence with the map that would guide generations of men toward wholeness. Because you need to know, even the master had to descend before he could show others the way. Now we come to the heart of everything. Jung's solution wasn't another spiritual system. It wasn't a set of beliefs to adopt or practices to perform. It wasn't about becoming more enlightened, more disciplined, or more transcendent. It was something far more radical. He called it individuation, the lifelong process of becoming a whole, integrated self by confronting and assimilating every part of the psyche you've been rejecting. For men specifically, this means something precise and terrifying. You must descend into everything you've been avoiding through these patterns and bring it back into conscious relationship, not transcend it, not fix it, not understand it from a distance. Integrate it. Here's what makes Jung's approach different from every other system of masculine development. Most approaches give you an ideal to strive toward: the warrior, the king, the sage, the integrated man. They show you the mountaintop and tell you to climb. Jung does the opposite. He says, Forget the mountaintop. You need to descend into the valley, into the cave, into the underworld of your own rejected psyche. And you need to stay there until you've met every part of yourself you've been running from. Only then, after the descent, after the encounter, after the integration, can you return transformed. This is the hero's journey applied to psychological development, but Jung made it concrete. He gave us the map. The 5 essential movements. Individuation for men requires 5 essential movements, not stages you complete once, but spiraling processes you return to throughout life at deeper levels. Think of these as 5 initiatory ordeals, each one confronting a different aspect of rejected masculinity, each one requiring you to die to an old identity and be reborn into something more whole. Let's go through them one by one. Movement 1. Shadow integration. The first movement is shadow integration, identifying and owning every quality, emotion, and impulse you've been projecting onto others. Your shadow is everything you've decided isn't you, everything you've rejected as bad, weak, dangerous, or unacceptable. For most men, this includes rage, shame, sexual desire, weakness, need, envy, cowardice, cruelty, pettiness, and powerlessness. You've spent your life pushing these qualities into the unconscious, denying them, projecting them onto other people so you can see them out there instead of in here. The warrior addict projects his weakness onto others and despises them for it. The victim martyr projects his power onto others and resents them for it. The intellectual dissociator projects his emotions onto others and judges them for being irrational. Every judgment you make about another person is a shadow projection. Every quality you hate in someone else exists in some form in you. Jung's method for shadow integration is brutal in its honesty. You must ask yourself daily, what did I judge, criticize, or condemn in another person today? Then you must own that quality in yourself. Not as a concept, not as an intellectual exercise, but as a felt reality. If you judged someone as weak, you must find and feel your own weakness. If you condemned someone as manipulative, you must discover your own manipulations. If you envied someone's success, you must acknowledge your own ambition and inadequacy. This is excruciating work because the shadow contains everything you've built your identity against. Owning it feels like dying. The man who prides himself on being rational must own his irrationality. The man who prides himself on being strong must own his fragility. The man who prides himself on being good must own his capacity for cruelty. Jung treated a minister who came to him in crisis. The man had spent his entire life embodying Christian virtue, compassion, forgiveness, service, purity. But in his dreams, he was committing murder, violating women, destroying sacred spaces. He was horrified. Jung told him, "These dreams are not showing you what you will do. They're showing you what you've been repressing. Your shadow contains everything opposite to your persona, and it's demanding integration." The work was for this minister to acknowledge, not act on, but acknowledge his capacity for violence, lust, destruction, and sacrilege, to stop splitting himself into all good persona and all bad shadow, and become a whole human who contains both. It took years. The man had to descend into parts of himself that terrified him, had to dialogue with his inner killer, his inner rapist, his inner destroyer, not to act on these impulses, but to understand them, own them, and integrate them consciously. By the end, he was a far more effective minister because he could meet people's darkness without judgment, having met his own. He could hold space for their shadow, having integrated his. Here's what shadow integration actually does. It collapses your projections. When you own your rage, you stop seeing everyone else as angry. When you own your weakness, you stop despising others for theirs. When you own your shame, you stop judging others so harshly. You become more human, more real, more capable of relationship. And paradoxically, integrating your shadow makes you less likely to act it out unconsciously. The rage you repress explodes unexpectedly. The rage you integrate becomes available energy, fierce when needed, dormant when not. Jung said it clearly, "We do not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." Shadow work is not optional. It's the foundation of everything else. Movement 2, Anima Encounter. The second movement is Anima Encounter, confronting your inner feminine that you've exiled or projected onto women. This is where most men get stuck, because this work requires you to acknowledge that you contain feminine qualities: emotion, receptivity, intuition, vulnerability, relatedness, soul. And for men raised in patriarchal culture, this feels like castration. Admitting you have an inner feminine feels like admitting you're not a real man. But Jung was clear: the anima is not your enemy. She is the gateway to your soul. Here's how the anima works psychologically. Every man has an inner image of the feminine, built from your mother, your culture's feminine ideal, your personal experiences with women, and archetypal structures in the collective unconscious. This inner feminine can be integrated or projected. When projected, you see it in the women you're attracted to. You fall in love with a woman because she carries your anima projection, your soul, your emotion, your capacity for connection that you've disowned. This is why romantic relationships feel so intense and irrational. You're not just relating to the woman, you're relating to your own projected psyche, and when she inevitably fails to live up to the projection, when she's human rather than goddess, you either idealize someone else or devalue her. The pattern repeats. Jung documented this in every man he treated. The anima projection creates a specific relational pattern. First, inflation. You meet a woman and she seems perfect. She embodies everything you've been missing. You feel alive, connected, whole. This is because you're encountering your own soul reflected in her. Second, disillusionment. She reveals her humanity. She's moody, irrational, demanding, or simply different from the ideal. Your anima projection shatters. Third, devaluation or idealization of another. Either she becomes the problem, you resent her for not being the goddess, or you find a new woman to project onto and start the cycle again. This continues until you withdraw the projection and encounter the anima within. The anima encounter is one of the most dangerous initiations because it requires you to feel, not think about feelings, not analyze emotions, but actually descend into your emotional body and experience what's there without defending against it. Grief, longing, tenderness, vulnerability, need, heartbreak, loneliness, yearning. These are anima qualities most men have exiled. They feel weak, unmasculine, dangerous. So you project them onto women and expect women to feel for you. Your partner becomes responsible for the emotional life you won't inhabit yourself. This is why so many men are emotionally dependent on women, while claiming to be independent. They've outsourced their inner feminine to outer women. Jung's method for anima integration is active imagination, dialoguing directly with the inner feminine figure, who appears in dreams, fantasies, and imagination. You don't analyze her. You speak with her. You ask her what she wants. You listen to her responses. You allow her to challenge, guide, and transform you. This feels absurd to the rational mind. I'm talking to an imaginary woman in my head. This is crazy. But Jung discovered it's the most direct route to the unconscious. The anima is the bridge between ego and self. She mediates between your conscious mind and the depths of your psyche, and she will not be ignored. If you refuse the inner encounter, she'll possess you from the outside, through addictions, through obsessive relationships, through mood swings you can't control. One of Jung's patients, a successful businessman, 45, second divorce, came to therapy because he kept falling into the same pattern. He'd meet a woman, become obsessed, reorganize his life around her, then wake up 6 months later wondering what happened. In his dreams, a mysterious feminine figure kept appearing, sometimes seductive, sometimes angry, sometimes sad, always demanding his attention. Jung had him engage her directly through active imagination. In their dialogues, she told him, "You keep looking for me out there, but I'm here. I'm the part of you that feels, that relates, that needs connection. Stop projecting me onto women and have a relationship with me first." This man spent 2 years in dialogue with his anima, learning to feel his own emotions, learning to need without collapsing, learning to be vulnerable without it being about a woman. When he finally entered his 3rd marriage, it was different. He wasn't looking for her to complete him. He was already relating to his inner feminine, so he could relate to the outer woman as a separate person, not a projection screen. Here's what anima integration does. It gives you access to your soul. Without it, you're all persona, all mask, all performance, all strategy. You can function, achieve, compete, but you can't feel meaning. You can't experience beauty, mystery, or depth. The anima is the bridge to the sacred, to art, to nature, to love, to everything that makes life worth living. Men who haven't integrated the anima are spiritually dead. They're walking through life on autopilot, performing roles, checking boxes, but never touching the depths. And they wonder why nothing satisfies, why success feels empty, why they're restless despite having everything. Because you can't access your soul through masculine consciousness alone. You need the feminine to bridge you there. Movement 3. Father-wound healing. The 3rd movement is father-wound healing, mourning the absent, abusive, or inadequate father, and reclaiming sovereign masculinity not dependent on external validation. Every man has a father wound. Even if your father was good, he was imperfect. Even if he was present, he couldn't give you everything you needed. Even if he tried, he was limited by his own wounds. And most men never mourn this. They either idealize the father, protecting the image to avoid grief, or demonize the father, staying angry to avoid loss. Both keep you bound to him. Both prevent sovereignty. Jung was explicit about the father complex in men. It shows up in 2 primary forms. The negative father complex. Your father was absent, abusive, weak, or inadequate. You spend your life proving you're different from him. You build your identity against him. You seek father figures in bosses, mentors, or gurus to fill the void. The positive father complex. Your father was successful, strong, admired. You spend your life trying to live up to him. You build your identity through him. You seek his approval even after he's dead. Both are forms of possession. Both keep you from becoming your own man. The father wound creates a specific pattern in men's psychology. You remain a boy, psychologically, no matter your age. You're either rebelling against the father or trying to please him. You're either proving you don't need validation or desperately seeking it. You're either avoiding authority or submitting to it. But you're not sovereign. You don't have your own center. Your masculinity is reactive, defined by what you're for or against, rather than generative. Jung treated countless men in their 40s and 50s who were still psychologically boys, still trying to prove themselves to a father who was long dead or no longer cared, still organizing their lives around either living up to or rebelling against paternal expectations. Here's what father-wound healing actually requires. Grief. You must mourn what you didn't receive, the initiation that never came, the blessing you never got, the guidance you needed but wasn't offered, the love that was conditional or absent. This is not about blaming your father. It's about acknowledging reality. He couldn't give what he didn't have. He couldn't initiate you if he wasn't initiated himself. But you still lost something, and that loss must be grieved. Most men skip this step. They go straight to forgiveness, understanding, or acceptance. He did his best. I don't blame him. I've moved on. But you can't move on from something you haven't felt. And unfelt grief becomes resentment, bitterness, or empty forgiveness that leaves you still bound. Jung's method was to have men dialogue with the father imago, the inner image of the father, not the actual man. You speak to your inner father. You tell him what you needed and didn't get. You express your anger, your grief, your longing. You allow him to respond, not with excuses, but with his own limitations. And then, crucially, you separate. You declare your psychological independence. You take back your power from him. You become your own authority. This is psychological patricide, killing the father in your psyche so you can become a man, not literal violence, symbolic death. The death of the father as the center of your psychological universe. One patient Jung describes, a 38-year-old architect, came to therapy paralyzed. He couldn't make decisions without consulting multiple mentors. He couldn't commit to relationships. He couldn't launch his own firm despite having the skills. In analysis, it emerged. His father was a successful architect who died when the patient was 16. He'd spent 22 years trying to become his father, live up to his father, honor his father's legacy. But he'd never mourned his father, never grieved the abandonment of losing him at that critical age, never separated psychologically to become his own man. The work was brutal. 6 months of grieving, crying for the first time since the funeral, raging at his father for dying, acknowledging how terrified and lost he'd been as a teenager without guidance. And then the separation. In active imagination, he told his father, I honor what you built, but I'm not you. I have my own path, and I release myself from the need to continue your legacy. I give myself permission to be different. Within a year, he'd launched his own firm with a completely different design philosophy. He was in a relationship. He was making decisions from his own center. He'd become his own man. Here's what father-wound healing gives you: sovereignty. You stop looking for permission, approval, or validation from external authorities. You become your own authority. You can respect mentors and learn from elders without submitting your power to them. You can be a son without being a boy. You can honor lineage without being bound by it. And critically, you can become a father to your own children or to younger men without passing on the wound, because you've healed it in yourself. Movement 4. Death encounter. The fourth movement is death encounter, facing literal or symbolic death through ordeal, loss, or ego dissolution to end identification with persona. This is the most terrifying initiation because it requires you to stop defending against your mortality. Most men spend their entire lives in death denial, building legacies, pursuing immortality projects, staying busy, avoiding stillness, refusing to acknowledge that this body, this identity, this life will end. Jung said the second half of life should be preparation for death, not morbidly, but consciously, because only by facing death can you live fully. The death encounter comes in multiple forms. Sometimes it's literal, a diagnosis, an accident, a near-death experience that confronts you with your mortality. Sometimes it's symbolic, a loss so profound it shatters your identity. The death of a relationship, the collapse of a career, the disintegration of meaning, the dark night where everything you thought you were dissolves. Sometimes it's intentional, choosing ordeal experiences, vision quests, extended fasts, psychedelic journeys, silence retreats that simulate death and rebirth. All of them serve the same function: ego dissolution, the death of the false self so the true self can emerge. Jung was clear: the ego must die, not literally but psychologically. The ego is the persona you've constructed, your roles, your achievements, your self-image, your defenses. It's necessary for the first half of life. It helps you function in the world, but it's not who you are. It's a mask you wear, a structure you've built, and if you identify with it, if you believe you are your roles, your accomplishments, your image, then you're trapped. Because all those things are temporary. They will end. And when they do, if that's all you are, you'll be destroyed. The death encounter breaks this identification. It forces you to discover what remains when everything you think you are is stripped away. Jung himself underwent this in his confrontation with the unconscious. Between 1913 and 1916, his entire identity structure collapsed. He lost his relationship with Freud, his mentor, father figure, professional security. He was ostracized by the psychoanalytic community. His professional reputation was threatened. More terrifying, his inner world erupted. He experienced visions, voices, and what felt like impending psychosis. Everything he'd built his identity on, rational thought, psychological understanding, professional success, couldn't help him. He described it as feeling like he was dying. The old Jung was dissolving, and he didn't know what would emerge. But he had a choice: resist the dissolution and fragment completely, or surrender to it and see what happened. He chose surrender, and what emerged from that death was his life's work. The theory of individuation, the concept of the collective unconscious, the map that would guide millions. But only because he died first. Only because he let the old identity structure dissolve. Here's what makes the death encounter essential. It ends your attachment to the persona. Before this, you're performing. You're maintaining an image. You're defending a self-concept. You're living for others' perception or your own ego gratification. After the death encounter, you can't anymore, because you've discovered something underneath all that, a self that exists independent of roles, achievements, or image. You become free, not reckless, but free. Because death anxiety is the root of most human suffering, and you've faced it. You can take risks because failure doesn't threaten your identity. You can be vulnerable because rejection doesn't destroy you. You can live authentically because you're no longer defending a false self. Jung treated men who'd survived literal near-death experiences, war, illness, accidents, and watched how they transformed. Some became more alive. They stopped wasting time. They left dead marriages, dead careers, dead beliefs. They lived with urgency and authenticity. Others became more defended. They built even bigger egos, accumulated more, stayed busier. They denied the encounter and returned to the pattern. The difference was whether they integrated the experience or repressed it. Integration means, I died, I came back, I'm not the same. What matters now is different. How I live must change. Repression means, that was scary, I'm glad it's over. Let's never think about it again and get back to normal. One leads to transformation. The other wastes the initiatory gift. Modern men need death encounters because culture no longer provides them. There are no vision quests, no walkabouts, no initiatory ordeals, so the psyche creates them through crisis, illness, loss, collapse, dark nights, and men either resist, medicating, distracting, bypassing, or they surrender and allow the old self to die. Jung's guidance was, when the death encounter comes, welcome it. See it as the psyche's attempt to free you from the prison of the persona. Die consciously, mourn what's ending, and wait in the emptiness for what wants to be born. Movement 5, Synthesis of Opposites. The fifth movement is synthesis of opposites, holding the tension between contradictory qualities until a third thing emerges that transcends and includes both. This is Jung's unique contribution, not choosing between opposites but integrating them. For men, this means holding strength and vulnerability, independence and connection, power and surrender, action and stillness, masculine and feminine, light and shadow. The uninitiated man splits. He identifies with one side and rejects the other. He's either strong or vulnerable, never both. Either independent or connected, never integrated. The initiated man synthesizes. He contains multitudes. He's strong and vulnerable simultaneously, independent and deeply connected, powerful and surrendered. Jung called this the transcendent function, the psyche's capacity to hold opposing tensions until something new emerges that reconciles them. This doesn't happen through thinking. You can't logic your way to synthesis. You have to hold the tension somatically, emotionally, existentially, until it transforms you. Here's what this looks like practically. You feel the pull to be strong, protective, assertive. Simultaneously, you feel the pull to be vulnerable, open, receptive. The old pattern would choose one and suppress the other. The initiated man holds both. He feels the tension. He doesn't resolve it prematurely. He stays in the discomfort of not knowing which is right. And eventually, a third way emerges. He can be strong in his vulnerability, protective through his openness, assertive in his receptivity. The opposites haven't disappeared. They've been integrated into something more complex, more real, more whole. Jung worked with men for years, helping them hold these tensions. The warrior who needs to integrate the lover, the thinker who needs to integrate the feeler, the ascetic who needs to integrate the sensualist. The work is never about becoming balanced, some bland middle point between extremes. It's about becoming whole, containing the full spectrum of human experience without splitting. One patient Jung describes was a judge, rational, principled, just, completely identified with thinking and order. But in his dreams, Dionysian figures appeared, wild, chaotic, dancing, intoxicated. His psyche was demanding synthesis, not that he abandon his rationality, but that he integrate the irrational, not that he become chaotic, but that he include wildness. The work took years. This man had to learn to dance, to play, to get drunk occasionally, to be foolish. All the things he'd rejected as beneath a judge's dignity. And what emerged was a better judge, because he could now understand the irrational motives behind crimes. He could see the human chaos beneath legal abstractions. He could dispense justice with mercy. He'd synthesized Apollo and Dionysus, order and chaos, law and wildness. He became whole. Here's the key insight. Synthesis doesn't mean you're always balanced. It means you have access to the full range when needed. The synthesized man can be fierce and tender. He's fierce when protection is needed. He's tender when connection is needed. He doesn't default to one or perform the other. He moves fluidly because both are integrated. He can lead and follow, act and receive, give and need, speak and listen. He's no longer trapped in one-dimensional masculinity. He's a complex, multi-dimensional human being. The lifelong spiral Jung emphasized this constantly. Individuation is not linear. It's a spiral. You don't complete shadow work and move on. You revisit your shadow at deeper levels throughout life. You don't integrate the anima once. You encounter her in new forms as you evolve. Each of these 5 movements is ongoing. You spiral through them. Shadow, anima, father, death, synthesis, again and again, each time going deeper, each time revealing more, each time integrating further. This is why Jung insisted individuation takes a lifetime. There's always more unconscious content to integrate, always more shadow to own, always deeper levels of the psyche to encounter. The goal is not to finish. The goal is to stay conscious and engaged with the process. And here's what makes this different from the 7 patterns. Individuation is conscious suffering chosen for the sake of wholeness. The patterns are unconscious suffering that keeps you fragmented. You're suffering anyway through anxiety, depression, emptiness, conflict, but you're not growing from it because you're avoiding the real work. Individuation says, suffer consciously, descend deliberately, face what you've been avoiding, and let it transform you. The suffering doesn't disappear. but it becomes meaningful, it becomes initiatory, it becomes the crucible in which the true self is forged. Jung's own Red Book is the documentation of this process. For years, he descended into active imagination, dialogued with unconscious figures, painted visions, wrestled with madness. It was terrifying. It was destabilizing. He thought he might not return, but he kept going because he understood. This was not breakdown. This was the initiatory descent necessary for wholeness. And what emerged was a man who'd integrated his opposites, who could hold the tension between science and mysticism, psychology and spirituality, ego and self. He became whole by descending into fragmentation and reassembling himself consciously. This is Jung's solution, not a system, not a practice, but a developmental blueprint. Integrate your shadow, encounter your anima, heal your father wound, face death, synthesize your opposites. Do this with brutal honesty. Do this with support from analysts, mentors, or elders who've done their work. Do this knowing you'll spiral through these movements many times throughout your life. Do this because the alternative, remaining fragmented, projecting chaos, staying uninitiated, is a life half-lived. But let me be honest with you about something Jung never sugarcoated. This work is brutally difficult. It requires years of commitment. It demands you face the most terrifying parts of yourself. It offers no shortcuts, no quick fixes, no 5-step programs. And even when you do it right, you'll still struggle. You'll still have bad days. You'll still feel lost sometimes, because wholeness isn't perfection. It's the capacity to hold your imperfection without fragmenting. So the question becomes, are you willing? Are you willing to descend into your shadow and own what you find there? Are you willing to encounter your inner feminine and let her transform you? Are you willing to mourn your father and claim your sovereignty? Are you willing to face death, literal or symbolic, and let your old self dissolve? Are you willing to hold contradictions until synthesis emerges? Most men aren't. Most men choose the patterns, the defensive strategies that keep them safe but stuck. And that's okay. There's no judgment here. Initiation cannot be forced. It must be chosen. But if you're still watching this, if something in you is responding to these words, then you've already begun. The call to descent has found you. Now the question is, will you answer? In the next section, we're going to look at men who answered that call and men who didn't. Historical figures, mythological heroes, Jung's own case files. We'll see what distinguishes those who completed initiation from those who remained trapped in patterns. What made the difference? What led to integration versus destruction? Because these aren't abstract concepts. These are lived realities. And the contrasts will show you exactly what's at stake. Here's what Jung understood that most people miss. The difference between a life of meaning and a life of destruction often comes down to a single choice. The choice to descend or to defend, to integrate or to inflate, to face the shadow or to project it onto the world. And we can see this choice and its consequences played out across history, mythology, and Jung's own case files. Let me show you what happens when men refuse initiation, and what happens when they embrace it. The contrasts are stark, the patterns are clear, and the lessons are undeniable. The failures, men who remained trapped. Let's start with the failures, not to judge them, but to learn from them. These are men of immense talent, intelligence, and potential, who became forces of destruction because they never completed their psychological initiation. Friedrich Nietzsche, the intellectual dissociator. Nietzsche is perhaps the clearest example of intellectual dissociation leading to catastrophic fragmentation. Here was a man of extraordinary genius, philosopher, poet, cultural critic. He saw through the illusions of his time with devastating clarity. He diagnosed the death of God, the rise of nihilism, the need for new values. but he lived entirely in his head. No intimate relationships, no emotional life, no embodiment of his philosophy. He wrote about the Übermensch, the overman who transcends conventional morality. But he himself remained trapped in his persona as the solitary genius. His shadow was completely unintegrated. His anima was entirely projected. His father wound, his actual father died when Nietzsche was 5, was never mourned or healed. And you can see it in his writing. Brilliant insights paired with growing grandiosity, profound truths mixed with increasing inflation. By the end, he's signing letters Dionysus and the Crucified One. In 1889, at age 44, Nietzsche had a complete mental breakdown in Turin. The story goes that he saw a horse being whipped, embraced it, and collapsed. He never recovered. He spent the last 11 years of his life in near catatonic psychosis, unable to speak coherently, cared for by his mother and sister. The man who wrote about becoming more than human ended his life as less than human. This is what happens when intellectual brilliance is not grounded in embodied integration, when insight is not matched by shadow work, when philosophy is not lived. Jung said of Nietzsche, he saw the truth but couldn't bear it. His ego identified with archetypal knowledge and shattered under the weight. Nietzsche needed to descend into his body, his emotions, his wounds. Instead, he ascended into abstraction, isolation, and eventually madness, the intellectual dissociator taken to its tragic conclusion. Howard Hughes, the transcendence. Junkie. Howard Hughes represents the transcendence pattern, the man who seeks escape from human limitation through control, isolation, and obsessive pursuit of perfection. Early in life, Hughes was a visionary, aviation pioneer, film producer, engineer. He pushed boundaries, broke records, innovated constantly, but underneath the success was profound fear of contamination, of death, of human messiness, of his own mortality. Rather than face these fears through psychological work, he tried to transcend them through control. He became increasingly isolated, germophobic, obsessive-compulsive. He built sealed environments where he could control every variable. He withdrew from human contact. He surrounded himself with yes-men who enabled his patterns. By the end of his life, Hughes was living in absolute isolation in hotel penthouses, refusing to see anyone, afraid of contamination, his body deteriorating while his mind obsessed over purity and control. He died at 70, weighing 90 pounds, with a long beard and fingernails, having not been outside in years. This is transcendence addiction in its final form, the attempt to escape human limitation by controlling the environment, purifying the body, isolating from relationship, all of it collapsing into the very decay and contamination he was trying to avoid. Hughes needed embodiment. He needed relationship. He needed to descend into his fear of death and messiness, rather than trying to transcend it. Instead, he built an increasingly elaborate prison of control that became his tomb. Adolf Hitler, the savior complex and shadow projection. We have to talk about Hitler, because he's the clearest and most catastrophic example of what happens when the savior complex and shadow projection operate at scale. Jung analyzed Hitler extensively during his rise to power. He saw in him a man possessed by archetypal energies he hadn't integrated, a wounded, failed artist whose personal inferiority complex inflated into messianic grandiosity. Hitler believed he was chosen to save Germany, to purify the race, to restore greatness. Classic savior complex, his personal wounds, rejection from art school, poverty, his father's abuse, were never healed. Instead, they were inflated into a mission to save the nation, and his shadow, completely projected onto the Jews, onto communists, onto anyone he deemed impure or threatening. Everything he hated in himself, his own weakness, his own impurity, his own failure, was projected outward and then systematically destroyed. This is the danger Jung warned about. Uninitiated men with power become vessels for collective shadow projection. Hitler wasn't just acting out his personal psychology. He was channeling the collective shadow of post-WWI Germany, the humiliation, the rage, the need for scapegoats. But because he was uninitiated, because he'd never integrated his own shadow or healed his own wounds, he couldn't hold these energies consciously. He was possessed by them, and the result was systematic genocide. The Holocaust, World War II, tens of millions dead. This is what happens when the savior complex meets unintegrated shadow at the level of political power. Jung said explicitly, Hitler is the unconscious of every German, but he is conscious of it, which makes him the most dangerous man in Europe. The spiritual guru who abuses, the bypassing pattern. Let's talk about a pattern that repeats constantly in spiritual communities. The guru who's achieved genuine spiritual insights but hasn't integrated his shadow and ends up sexually, financially, or emotionally exploiting his students. You've seen this. Rajneesh, Andrew Cohen, Sogyal Rinpoche, Bikram Choudhury. The list is long and depressing. These men had real spiritual experiences, real insights, real capacity to guide others in meditation, awakening, or transformation, but they bypassed the shadow work. They transcended to spiritual heights without integrating their personal wounds, their sexuality, their power dynamics, their narcissism, and eventually the unintegrated shadow erupted. Sexual misconduct, financial exploitation, emotional abuse, creating dependency rather than empowerment. Jung predicted this pattern. He said the most dangerous spiritual teachers are those who've had genuine awakening experiences but haven't done the horizontal work of integrating their psychology. They're inflated, identified with the spiritual archetype rather than relating to it consciously. They believe they're beyond ego, beyond shadow, beyond the need for accountability, and their students, hungry for transcendence, project their own savior complex onto these teachers, creating a toxic feedback loop. The teacher needs the adoration to maintain his inflation. The students need the guru to avoid their own descent. Nobody does the real work of integration until it collapses. Scandal, exposure, destruction. These teachers needed to integrate their sexuality, their need for power, their human limitations before they started teaching. They needed horizontal development, shadow work, anima integration, father wound healing to match their vertical attainment. Instead, they bypassed the human work and became cautionary tales. Icarus and Narcissus, mythological warnings. The myths gave us these warnings thousands of years ago. Icarus, the boy whose father built him wings, told not to fly too high or the sun would melt the wax, not too low or the sea would wet the wings. But Icarus, in his inflation, flies too close to the sun. The wings melt. He plummets to his death. This is warrior inflation, the pattern of men who identify with power, success, and ascent, without grounding in limitation and mortality. They fly too high, they crash. Narcissus, the beautiful youth who falls in love with his own reflection in a pool and wastes away staring at it, unable to touch what he desires, dying of his own self-absorption. This is the man who cannot see beyond his own reflection, his own persona, his own self-image. He's trapped in the mirror stage, unable to encounter the other, unable to descend into relationship. He dies of his own isolation. These myths are psychological warnings. They're showing us what happens when men inflate, when they identify with persona, when they refuse the descent. Icarus needed grounding. Narcissus needed the anima encounter, the movement from self-absorption to genuine relationship with the other. Neither could make that movement. Both were destroyed by their patterns. The successes, men who completed initiation. Now let's look at the other side. Men who faced the same challenges, the same wounds, the same temptations toward patterns, but chose the descent, chose integration, and emerged transformed. Viktor Frankl, Meaning Through Suffering. Viktor Frankl survived Auschwitz, 3 years in Nazi concentration camps. His parents, brother, and pregnant wife all murdered. Every external meaning structure stripped away. Facing death daily, witnessing unspeakable horror. This was an initiatory ordeal he didn't choose, but he chose how to meet it. In the camps, Frankl observed 2 types of men: those who collapsed into victimhood, giving up, losing hope, dying spiritually before their bodies died, and those who found meaning even in the horror, caring for others, maintaining dignity, choosing their attitude despite circumstances. Frankl chose the latter. He didn't bypass the suffering, he descended into it fully, but he transformed it through meaning. After liberation, he wrote Man's Search for Meaning, one of the most important psychological texts of the 20th century. He founded logotherapy, a school of psychotherapy based on the principle that the primary human drive is the search for meaning, not pleasure or power. He integrated his suffering. He didn't become bitter, didn't project his rage onto the world, didn't collapse into nihilism. He transformed his ordeal into wisdom and spent the rest of his life helping others find meaning in their suffering. This is initiation completed, the descent into death, the integration of horror, the return with gifts for the community. Frankl faced everything the patterns are designed to avoid: powerlessness, meaninglessness, mortality, suffering, and came through more whole, not more fragmented. Nelson Mandela, Rage Transformed into Forgiveness. Nelson Mandela spent 27 years in prison, 27 years, for fighting against apartheid, for demanding justice, for refusing to submit to oppression. Early in his imprisonment, Mandela was full of rage, righteous rage at his oppressors. The warrior energy was strong. He wanted to fight, to destroy the system, to take revenge. But he had 27 years to work with that rage, to integrate it rather than act it out impulsively, to transform it through reflection, relationship, and conscious choice. He studied his oppressors. He learned Afrikaans. He read their poetry. He sought to understand them, not to excuse them, but to see their humanity. This is shadow integration at the collective level, recognizing that the oppressor is also human, also wounded, also trapped in patterns. When Mandela was released, he could have led a violent revolution. He had every right to. His people wanted it. His rage justified it. But he chose reconciliation. He chose the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, a process of hearing the pain on all sides, acknowledging the horror, and choosing forgiveness over revenge. This wasn't spiritual bypassing. This wasn't suppressing his rage. This was integrated rage transformed into mature power. He became South Africa's first black president. He led the nation through a peaceful transition that could easily have become civil war. He built bridges where others would have burned them. And he did this because he'd spent 27 years in his own initiatory ordeal, integrating his shadow, transforming his rage, and emerging as an elder. Jung would have recognized this. Mandela completed the 5 movements: shadow integration, owning his rage and transforming it; anima encounter, developing his relational capacity and emotional intelligence; father wound healing, moving beyond reactive rebellion to mature leadership; death encounter, facing literal death threat and existential meaninglessness for 27 years; and synthesis of opposites, holding both justice and mercy, strength and forgiveness, warrior and peacemaker. He became whole, and that wholeness allowed him to heal a nation. Carl Jung, Navigating Near Psychosis. Into psychology, we have to include Jung himself. because his journey is the template for everything we're discussing. After his break with Freud in 1913, Jung entered what he called his confrontation with the unconscious. For years, he experienced visions, heard voices, felt he was on the edge of psychosis. This was his initiatory crisis. Everything he'd built his identity on was dissolving. His professional reputation was at risk. His inner world was erupting with material he couldn't control. He could have chosen the patterns. He could have intellectually dissociated from the experience, analyzing it from a safe distance. He could have transcended it through spiritual bypassing. He could have collapsed into victimhood. Instead, he descended, deliberately, consciously. He engaged the visions through active imagination. He painted them. He dialogued with the figures that appeared. He recorded everything in what became the Red Book. For years, Jung didn't know if he'd come back. He thought he might be going insane, but he trusted the process. He stayed with the descent. And what emerged was the foundation of analytical psychology, the theory of archetypes, the concept of individuation, the map of the psyche that would guide millions, but only because he went through it himself first, only because he didn't bypass the ordeal. Jung's initiation gave him authority, not the authority of academic credentials or professional position, but the authority of lived experience. He'd been to the underworld and returned. He'd faced the material he was asking others to face. This is why his work has such power. It's not theory, it's testimony. Odysseus, the long journey home. In mythology, Odysseus is the archetypal initiated man. His journey home from Troy took 10 years of ordeals. He faced the Cyclops, confronting brute shadow. He resisted the sirens, integrating the anima's seduction without being possessed. He descended into the underworld, death encounter. He lost all his men and had to return alone. Ego, death, and isolation. Each trial was an initiation. Each challenge required him to integrate something new. And when he finally returned to Ithaca, he wasn't the same man who left. He'd been transformed. He couldn't just reclaim his throne. He had to prove himself again, this time with wisdom earned through ordeal. The suitors occupying his home represent the inflated, uninitiated men, taking what doesn't belong to them, abusing power, operating from ego without wisdom. Odysseus, the initiated warrior, defeats them not through brute force, but through strategy, patience, and the wisdom earned through his journey. This is the pattern of successful initiation: descent, ordeal, transformation, return. Odysseus could have tried to bypass the journey. He could have chosen the easy routes offered: stay with Calypso in eternal youth, remain with Circe in pleasure, avoid the difficult trials. But he chose the hard road, the road of conscious suffering and integration, and he returned home transformed, capable of mature leadership, carrying wisdom earned through pain. Parsifal, failing until humility opens the door. The Grail legend gives us Parsifal, the young knight who fails the Grail quest multiple times before finally succeeding. His first attempt, he finds the Grail castle, sees the wounded Fisher King, witnesses the Grail procession, but fails to ask the crucial question, "What ails thee?" He's so inflated by his knightly identity, so eager to prove himself, that he can't see the suffering right in front of him. He can't be present to another's pain. The castle vanishes. He's cast out. He spends years searching, increasingly desperate, his confidence eroding. This is the necessary deflation. The warrior inflation must collapse before genuine compassion can emerge. When Parsifal finally returns to the Grail castle, he's different. He's been humbled. He's suffered. He's learned compassion through his own wounds. Now, when he sees the Fisher King, he asks the question, not from duty or protocol, but from genuine care. And the question itself heals the king. The Grail is revealed. the wasteland blooms. This is the movement from uninitiated to initiated masculinity, from performing roles to genuine presence, from seeking glory to serving others, from inflation to grounded compassion. Parsifal failed multiple times. That's the point. Initiation is not about getting it right the first time. It's about persisting through failure, letting failure teach you, returning again and again until you're transformed. What distinguished the successes from the failures? Looking at these contrasts, certain patterns emerge. The men who completed initiation shared specific qualities. First, willingness to suffer consciously. Frankl, Mandela, Jung, they didn't avoid suffering. They descended into it, stayed with it, and transformed through it. They chose conscious suffering over unconscious numbing. The failures tried to escape suffering through patterns. Nietzsche into abstraction, Hughes into control, Hitler into projection. Second, submission to something greater than ego. The successful men submitted to truth, to justice, to the self, to the process. They allowed themselves to be changed rather than demanding the world change to fit them. The failures inflated, believing they were special, chosen, beyond ordinary human limitation. Third, integration rather than transcendence of shadow. Mandela integrated his rage. Jung integrated his madness. Odysseus integrated each challenge he faced. The failures projected their shadow. Nietzsche onto the masses, Hughes onto contamination, Hitler onto scapegoats, the spiritual abusers onto their students. Fourth, return to community with wisdom. The successful men didn't stay on the mountaintop. They returned. Frankl shared his insights. Mandela led his nation. Jung trained analysts. Odysseus reclaimed his kingdom and restored order. The failures withdrew. Nietzsche into isolation and madness, Hughes into sealed rooms, Hitler into a bunker where he killed himself. Fifth, humility earned through ordeal. Every successful initiate was humbled. The ordeal stripped away inflation and left something more real. Flawed, limited, mortal, but also more powerful for being grounded. The failures maintained their inflation until it destroyed them. Here's what this means for you. Initiation is not about becoming more spiritual, more powerful, or more enlightened. It's about becoming more human, flawed, mortal, limited, connected, real. The successes didn't transcend their humanity. They fully inhabited it. They integrated their shadows rather than projecting them. They chose descent over escape. They became ordinary men who'd done extraordinary inner work. And that made all the difference. The question for you is, which path will you choose? Will you follow the pattern of the failures, staying in patterns, avoiding the descent, inflating or deflating, projecting your chaos onto the world? Or will you follow the pattern of the successes, descending consciously, integrating your shadow, suffering your way to wisdom and returning to serve? Because the choice is yours. The patterns are default. They require no effort. You can stay stuck your entire life without ever choosing it consciously. But initiation requires choice. It requires commitment. It requires you to say yes to the descent when every instinct screams to escape. Now, you might be thinking, but Jung completed his initiation. He's the model of success. Surely he had it all figured out. And that's exactly what we need to address next, because Jung's journey wasn't clean, it wasn't perfect, it was messy, terrifying, and nearly destroyed him before it transformed him. In the next section, we're going deep into Jung's personal crisis, his confrontation with the unconscious, the Red Book years, his near-psychotic break and how he navigated it into the foundation of analytical psychology, because you need to see, even the master struggled. Even the guide got lost. Even Jung himself had to descend into the patterns before he could transcend them.